Yeah, so welcome to day 3 of week 2. Yesterday really concluded all the stuff we've been learning up to now about like this is the structure of an HTML document. Going forward, we're gonna start today learning CSS, which as we talked about a little bit yesterday is really about the presentation aspect of this. We had started to dabble with this a little bit last night, but we're really going to dive into the fundamentals of why this works this way, what makes what we can look for in selectors and properties, when we're going to use inline styles versus external style sheets. But we played around with this yesterday, and I just want to touch on this because it came up kind of as a question near the end regarding some of the semantic tags. So the ones like header, nav, article, section, footer, and aside. Right. When we were playing yesterday in this last page, we made header ID header. We can use these types of semantic tags in the structure of our document so that it's a little bit better for accessibility. The browsers know what to do with it a little bit better, and we can really use the content correctly in a way that will be really beneficial going forward in the long term. So we briefly touched on it yesterday, but I just wanted to kind of hammer in that these are really useful tags, and you're going to probably want to use them structurally wherever it makes sense. If you're talking about a header where you've got a logo and stuff like that, you're going to want to use that. When you're building navigation items like a menu or even a list of links in the bottom of the page in the footer, you're going to want to use nav, and so on and so forth. Any questions about this before we really dive in and start playing with CSS? No? Cool. All right. CSS. What is CSS? We've talked about this time and time again over the last week and a half, but essentially CSS is a different kind of language that lets us describe how our content is going to look, right? So when we talked about like how things were merged into HTML way back in the olden days, we had font tags that control colors, all kinds of nasty nonsense, so that inside your products, all of the descriptions of how things would look was merged in and meshed with what we were doing to describe what the actual content itself was. CSS came along about 20 years ago, 15 and a half or so, and really gave us a new expressive language to separate how things look from how they behave and how they're structured, from a content perspective. This has revolutionized web development in a way that is really interesting and unique. We took a look at CSS Zen Garden yesterday to show you that any given HTML document can have millions of styles applied to it just by swapping out CSS files. Right? A really common modern example, and I'm sure you guys have come across this as you use web products. A lot of companies will offer a night mode, right? That is often just a separate CSS file that says, "Hey, load this file and make everything like a dark color with light font as the text." Right? That's a really easy way that CSS is visible as a very powerful technique and a tool that you're going to want to have in your toolbox for some of the functionality you can get out of it. Now, CSS is not a programming language. We're not going to put any complex things in there that let us handle databases and stuff. But what it is really is a list of three major things. Selectors, which we were talking about like the tag versus the element. We were looking at a selector that uses an ID or a selector that uses a class. The selector describes what we're operating on. Okay, which element will this rule apply to? The property, which is what is the thing that we're trying to change. Each element has a whole bunch of different properties, and as we saw, we can overwrite those properties to our heart's content. Things like border, background color, display, whether it's inline or block, and then the value itself. So we're going to dive in today. There's a whole bunch of different value options that each of these properties can have, and so we're going to learn. We were playing around yesterday. If we pull up our little silly website here, we were playing around yesterday with the width of these elements and saying we want these navigation elements to be 200 pixels wide. Right? There are like 15 other dimensional properties dimensional values that you use. We could use inches. We could use centimeters. We could use percentages. We could set a minimum and maximum. So all of the different values that you have at your disposal inside each and every property is. We're going to be showing a lot of different things, but more importantly, we're going to be showing how do you find out what all those values are. And it's going to be a lot of the same techniques that we've used in the HTML section. The resources that we learned before, W3 Schools, that's going to stick with you forever. And we're also going to learn how to play with this inside the developer console so that you can see a quick and easy list of things to do. Plus, Visual Studio Code, because we've installed that plugin that makes it understand the HTML and CSS, it's going to give you with IntelliSense some of the suggestions as well. So if I set color, right, and I put in a colon, these are all the options it thinks you might want to put next, right? And we're going to learn how to use that as well. Oftentimes, when I'm working with CSS, because I'm not, as I've mentioned, a designer, I'm not particularly artistic, I spend most of my time in CSS kind of having a rough idea of what I want to do, and then I'll change something very small, and I'll see if it's better or worse, and then I'll go change it again, and I'll change it again, over and over and over. My process is very iterative. For someone who's more artistic, or that can visualize what they want things to look like to begin with, you might take a different approach and start purely from an existing mock-up, right? Some companies will have designers that will build something in Photoshop and say, we want it to look exactly like this. And then it's just a matter of knowing how to translate a design into an actual working CSS mechanism. Okay? All right, on to the next thing. So what is the anatomy of a selector? We've seen this a couple times, right? It always starts at the very beginning with a selector, right? So that's going to be either a tag plus an ID by itself. This is always the selector, and it always comes first. Then you can have any number of CSS rules or properties that are defined inside that selector. So we're always going to have squiggly brackets that all of our rules are going to exist within. And we did this up here, right? So each one of these is a selector. We've got our squiggly brackets, and then the browser is smart enough to know that each of these lines independently is the stylistic rules we're going to apply to any element that matches this selector, right? And then the value. That always comes after a colon, right? So you're going to say the property is here, then we're going to put in a colon. Everything that comes after the colon is the value. And then we end each and every line with a semicolon. This is a really great introduction. I mean, these are the grammar and syntax rules. We were talking about syntax last week. Semicolons are really common. And whether you're working in PHP or JavaScript, which we're going to learn later in this course, or CSS, many programming languages use a semicolon at the end of a line to say, hey, everything that I did before then is now finished, right? This statement is complete. You see this in C++, you see this in C, and there are exceptions, right? And we even know that, we were kind of dabbling with this yesterday. Do we have a paragraph in here that's easy to see? Yeah, that lorem ipsum, yeah. So if I take this semicolon out, this page still shows that property being successfully done. But where this gets important is if I had more than one rule, and I went in here and I said border 1px solid red, right? It broke because now we have a statement and the browser is trying to process this as if this was what you'd written, right? So the semicolon is what tells us these are two separate properties that we're trying to set. So whenever you're starting to have, it's kind of a common joke, especially for new software engineers, that like whenever there's something broken, most of the time you're missing a semicolon somewhere, right? Almost always. But now that we see we got this correctly, save, right, we can see now that the border shows up and it goes back to that color we were expecting. Okay, so that's the anatomy of a selector. Now, we're going to spend quite a bit of time today talking about the complexity of selectors, how these things cascade together, and we kind of showed that off yesterday, that you can have rules that inherit from other rules, but in general, it's always going to follow this kind of format. You're going to have a selector, squiggly brackets, then a property with a colon, and then the value. Any questions about any of this so far? I mean, we've kind of touched on this a bunch, but now is the time if you want to know more. Nope? All right. Let's talk about structurally how we're going to do these things. We're going to pull up our console, right? We've got a few different ways that we can do styles, right? We've done this before. We've played with this a couple times during the week. So like this H2 that says fun with divs. Let's take a look at that first. Right now, this is styled without any style. Fun with divs, right? This one right here. It's just using the default H2 style. So the first thing we're going to look at is called an inline style, right? And so that would be an attribute that exists specifically on this element. And we can come in here and say inline style, background, color, green, right? So now as soon as I save this file, you can see behind the scenes, this changed to green, okay? Inline styles, I'll often use these when I'm just trying to get in and get out really quickly and implement a thing. We were talking about my iterative process, the way I go about doing things. I might go in here and just look at one div or one element and be like, okay, this is blue. What if I want to make this a lighter color blue? I might come in here with an inline style and change this, okay? Almost always in the real world when you're building, Can I zoom in to Visual Studio Code? I can increase my font size a bit. Is that a little bit better? Yeah. Just like with our CSS properties, we're holding them in between squiggly brackets. I can put multiple styles in this individual style attribute. So I can come in here and say color white, right? So this was black before, and now this is white, right? As long as we're separating these statements with a semicolon, we can put as many statements in here as we want. Now, the reason why this is probably bad is A, we're breaking the first rule, which is we're putting style information inside of our HTML content, right? So if I'm working on a product and I'm going here being like, why is this green? And I have my CSS file open, it might not be apparent to me that the place I need to check, if I go bigger, it's going to be really hard for us to see anything. We'll try this for a little bit. So if I'm working in here, it's difficult as a software engineer to know where to look for things if we're mixing our style information with our HTML, right? It's a bad practice, and we're trying to learn that this is not the way to go. It's important as a tool for you as developers to be able to play with things, right? You can quickly prototype something. You can just go in here and make changes without bringing another file into the mix. That is one way to go, and you just need to be aware that this exists as an option. Another way that this is going to be impactful to you, especially as we learn JavaScript later on, is that when we're operating on these elements with JavaScript, if we wanted to change the color, if I pull up a console here and I say document.getElementById, right? We kind of did this last night, and I say h2. Does that one have a? Let's give this an ID real quick so we can play with it. ID equals dumb heading, right? And I come in here and I say dumb heading, right? We can see that style attribute is in here, and as soon as I'm going in here and I'm saying style dot what did we do yesterday? I almost never do this. So let's check on a dot style. Yeah, there we go. Dot background color equals, so it's green right now, and if we change this to red, right? What is actually happening in JavaScript is it's essentially overriding what's in this style element here. It's adding more information to it. So if we click on this right here, you can see that the background color style of that element has been changed using this type of technique to be red. But as soon as you reload the page, that disappears, right? That's JavaScript is operating on the individual element's style, just like this. That's inline. Is everyone kind of following along so far? Almost always, you're never going to build a product that has a bunch of this going around, where you've got style interspersed with your HTML. The next thing that we're going to talk about is, what do we call it in our document here? We called it internal CSS. And that's just a fancy way of exactly what we described up here. So we're going to go into our head, we're going to add a style tag, and the style tag has an optional attribute of type equals text/CSS, right? But most of the time we won't do that anymore, we'll just say style. And then in here we can put any number of rules that we want. We can have, this is the exact same as if we had this in a separate external file. You'll do this pretty often, and kind of in the same sort of example I gave before, almost always before I'm going to start working with an external file, I will almost always just come in here, so I'm editing one file and updating it and just checking to see what it looks like, right? My process is iterative, and so I'm almost always going to be just operating on one file, okay? And the cool thing about this is that we're putting this in the head, but I could just as easily come in here. There's nothing preventing us from going in and making a style element right in here, and let's operate on this, where was it at? Here, let's just copy this down by our code. So what you might do when you're playing with these, where did it go? Oh, right here. This H2, right? We can come in here and we can add a bunch of rules just to see what it would look like. So we can say dumb heading, and we're going to say background color blue, and then I'm going to put in not important, right? Or I'm going to use the important tag so that it overrides that green, right? So I might play with styles inside my file like this, where I want to have a bunch of rules, but I want to make sure that I don't leave this information in line, polluting it later on. So it's really easy when we get to the next part we're going to talk about. I can copy all this stuff and take this directly into a new type of file, and now I can link in and export that and use external CSS, right? So external CSS is probably 99% of the things, is 99% of the way you're going to primarily work in CSS. And the way we'll show this off right now is it introduces two new tags, right? The first is link, right? So this is a heading specific thing. This almost always has to go in the head. It doesn't have to. You can put it down inside the body and it will work just fine, but we'll explain in a little bit why you always want to almost put this in the head. It's going to require a few attributes that are super important. So link rel equals style sheet, right? You always have to include this or everything will break. And href, which is a link to our file. So we were talking earlier this week or late last week about the structure of your folders. This is where I would go in and I would put in all of my CSS files are going to exist in the CSS folder. So I'll come in here and say CSS, and then I'll say week2.css, right? And then I come in here. This tag does not need a closing tag, so it just sits by itself. There's no end link tag like we use with some of the other HTML elements. But by default, let's say I took all of this information out, all the stuff we had in line. So now our web page is going to be back to being ugly, right? Just generic blank HTML. We've been working with this all week. This should look familiar, right? But if I come to my project list directory here, and I make a new file, and I say this is called week2.css, I can just paste in all of that CSS rules that we had in that previous internal style sheet. And as soon as I click save here, you see when the page reloads, all of our styles and formats have come back. Now, what is the one thing we need to be aware of in terms of external style sheets? The biggest one, and this is one of the things why you would probably use an internal style sheet for development and a different one for external development, is that your browser is very, very efficient at saving the files in a cache. Who wants to tell me what a cache is? We haven't talked about this at all. Does anyone know what a cache?
Is that like the data that your computer saves from website?
Yeah, exactly right. Behind the scenes, when we request this website, and this website is silly because all we're loading is one single CSS file, but on most projects, especially as we get a little bit more complex later on, you're going to have 10 or 15 JavaScript files, maybe 3 or 4 CSS files, a whole bunch of images. The browser is intelligent enough to know, like, hey, this probably isn't going to change between requests, right? So I'm going to store a copy of this and not update it, right? This will happen really common when you're working on like big projects and you actually display it to the world. If I made a CSS change right now, and I'm not sure what will happen because we're working on this fun little silly thing, because we're using a server that is local to the computer. Let's change this. We want to change our background color, the one that is a nice yellow. We want to make this. Come on, click the thing. Give me my color picker, dang it. I don't know. I'm just gonna force this because this is stupid. Oh, background color red, right? So now we want this to be red. Okay. So in this example, it didn't work because the cache didn't actually cache. Whatever this little plugin we're using is smart enough to know, hey, I'm in the middle of development. Give me the newest version. But in general, the browser, if you're on the internet, is going to say, I don't need to check this file every time. So if we're using an external style sheet, there's the potential, and this is especially true of your users, you might launch some new excellent feature of your website, and the people go to the page, and they don't see anything that has changed. And it's because they have to clear their cache or use a hard reload, which is Control-Shift-R on a Windows computer or Command-Shift-R on a Mac, right? So you have to go in there and actually force it to say, everything that is on this page, I want the new copies of this. Okay? But in general, you're going to use external style sheets. You're always going to have generally something that sits off to the side, is its own separate file, maybe lives in its own folder, and it defines the rules of style for your website. So does everyone kind of understand? Inline styles are styles that apply to a single specific tag, and internal style sheets are anything that we put in between the style tag, and then external style sheets are a completely separate file just filled with rules. And you'll notice that inside this style sheet, we don't have any tag that tells us we're in a style sheet, right? So we don't have a style tag up here like we did in our website. It's just the CSS rules themselves. You don't put anything else in here, just CSS. Everyone tracking? Those are the 3 types. Inline, internal, and external. Yes? Good. All right, CSS selectors. Let's spend a little bit more time diving into this deeply. Okay, so we learned about a few of these earlier. So we talked about like you can call a thing an element, right? So let's pull up our thing. An element is just a tag. So anything that is a tag in HTML can be a tag or an element selector. So we can come in here and say UL. That this is a valid selector for an unordered list. I can come in here and say I want my H2s to be this, right? Anything that is an HTML tag inside those angle brackets, that is the first word of the tag, is a selector. That is an element selector. The next thing that we looked at, and we saw an example down here, is the pound sign. Anything that, if it's the pound, the hashtag, shift3, whatever you want to call this symbol, this means that it is an ID specific selector. So generally, I mean, what is the caveat with IDs that we learned about yesterday? How many of them are you going to have per page? You're going to have one. So in a CSS rule, if I'm trying to get my heading, right, that was one of our IDs, right, that's only going to operate ever on one element. Okay? Another type of selector, and we learned about this yesterday as well, is the dot. Does anyone remember what the dot is a selector of?
Class.
Class, exactly right. And the classes, if you recall, is the one that you want to use for multiple elements. So we had subheadings, right? Subheading. This was all of our headings that was on that page would get this class, so that would operate on many things. Great. All right, so those are the three main types, right? So we've got elements, IDs, and classes. Now there are a few other types that we'll learn about later, but they're out of the scope of this discussion. But in general, all of those things can be mixed and matched. So we saw this yesterday, and we could say H1, or what do we call it? We made it a header ID header. Let's put a class in here for fun too. Class equals content section. Right, so header is the tag, the ID is header, and the class is content section. This, if you look in your Visual Studio Code, up at the very top, we have a thing that is telling us the selector that would get us here, right? But you can mix and match this any number of ways you want. But if we want to talk about this specific element, it would be header, hashtag header, dot content section. And if we added a second class in here, let's call it fun, right? You can chain those together, right? So we could talk about multiple elements at the same time. So we could come in here, and if we wanted to operate on that header, right, we could do it like this. This would be an element or a tag specific thing. We can come in here and say header, ID header, which would reference that individual thing. And then we can also use mix and match any number of classes, and we'd separate each class with a dot. So what would we call it? Content section, and the other one was fun, right? So this now, if I made font size, let's do something really ridiculous, 45 pixels, right? We are now making this, what is inside that header? Fun with divs and spans? Let's take this out. Right. So now we've made this massive, okay? If you try to chain these elements in here, right, .fun, it breaks because even though our browser is telling us, our file is telling us that this is the official thing, it's either or, right? So if we wanted to capture either section, content section or .fun, right? If we wanted to have multiple, so let's show this off in here. So we've got this element here. Let's make another one here, and we'll say class equals fun. Right, so we've added that fun element to another thing, but we can see that it did not copy it because this is specific, right? This is saying just operate on that one that matches header with an ID of header with a thing of content section. But we can also come in here and chain rules together. So we can put a comma in and say, or anything that is .fun. And so now you'll see fun with divs is bigger as well, right? Because that was the one that we added here. Just like with everything else that we've been talking about so far, like the white space or the amount of padding, that doesn't matter. Oftentimes if I'm working with a CSS property that has a bunch of elements that I want to capture, I might come in here and add a comma and just keep adding stuff on down. So I might be like P, do we have any classes on any of our P's? Nah, let's add one. Class equals silly, right? I can say p.silly. Also, I want to have font size 45 pixels. And so now all of our text is huge too. Okay? Any number of elements that we want, any number of selectors that we want to attach these rules to, we can separate with a comma. Everyone following along? Let's talk about specificity for a little bit. This is where things really start to get complicated and interesting. So let's say we have two rules. We have a header, and we have a header that has font size 15px, right? By default, these rules have the exact same selector. But you see, if you notice behind the scenes, we actually made the font quite a bit smaller as soon as we brought this in. So by default, it's going to go from top to bottom. Okay, so whatever is the last most requested rule is going to be the one that is applied. Now, the caveat to that is it's based on specificity. And so the specificity means this is more specific. I care about this rule more than the other rule. This is one of the few things that will break this kind of flow where it goes from top to bottom. If I come in here and I say header, now this has taken over and it goes back to being big, even though it is the same element and is defined above instead of below. And the reason is because we've given more specificity, we've given more rules to the property selector, or to the selector itself, that says, I'm actually talking about this specific element, okay? Is everyone tracking so far? So the more information you put in here, the more specific it will be, right? But if I did the same thing, header, right? Now it goes back to being small. But specificity also has to do with the structure as well, right? So we know that this header, the header element, exists within the div of main page. We can chain extra specificity in here by saying div.mainPage space header is saying I want any header that exists within inside div.mainPage. Okay, so now this has more specificity than this. And we could cheat, and we can come in here and say div, right? So we've called a div so that it's the same type of rule, and if we turn this off, this would actually apply, and it would make this a small font. But because this has a class attached to it, this is more specific than this. But we can cheat and make this more specific again if we just went in here and said, so the more things we can chain, the better. So let's come in here. Let's add an ID to our body. ID equals cool page. Okay. Cool page. All right. So now our body element has an ID, and now you can see this is more specific. Are you guys following along? How like by default it's going to go from top to bottom. If you have a whole bunch of elements that are together that have the same rules, it's going to go with whatever's the last one. But you can override it by adding more rules in your selector. Right, so the more, in general, the general rule of thumb, just to kind of keep in your head, is the bigger this string of like selectors that lets the browser know that I'm talking about this specific element, the more likely it is to be the main one. Okay, so now we have this, and we have header. Now, there is one tag that I used as an example earlier. Stop giving me pop-ups when I don't want to. There's a special value that is the exclamation point and then important. This will override specificity on a single property. So anywhere in my CSS file, if I 100% of the time say I've designed this beautiful page and I definitely want this to go through, exclamation point important. And if we hover over it, it says indicates the desired. Oh, that's talking about the font. Don't worry about that. So important, anywhere you got it in here, it goes at the end of the value, right before the semicolon, and it says, no matter what happens in here, this is the most important. Now, you want to use this sparingly, because if you got exclamation point important floating around everywhere, all the other rules apply. It goes by specificity then. So if I put not important in here, now you can see the browser still doesn't know what to do, so it's going to go back to the previous thing. But if you use this tool sparingly, and we say, I've developed this big, beautiful CSS file, everything is laid out and structured exactly how I want it to, but this one stupid element right here is causing me trouble, you can go in and say, I'm going to override that rule. Got it? So specificity. It's kind of a complicated concept to just let us know I am talking about this element, and we used the example yesterday. If we had two Andrews in this room, specificity says Andrew Buchholz instead of Andrew somebody else, right? we know we're talking about our Andrew and not some other Andrew. Andrew Garfield, the president, or whoever it is, right? Got it? So the more names we can tack on, the better. All right, cool. We talked about multiple selectors. Multiple selectors, again, is we're separating this with commas, right? So I could say P, comma, right? Now this is going to apply to our P. Now let's do it to the big one so it's easier to see. Right? So every paragraph and every div main header is going to be big. Got it? That's multiple selectors. And then nested selectors is that is the second part, which was as we add more elements in here, it's getting more specific in the thing. This is the nested part, right? Every element that you put a space in between, it's going to say this element has to exist inside this other element. Okay? Everyone tracking, following along so far? There are a few other examples that are kind of interesting to be aware of. You will come across these pretty frequently. I forget how to use them. So like let's turn this off. Let's take out this so we can see what we're playing with here. It is go ahead, Andrew.
How do you comment in CSS if you want to just comment something out to turn it off?
Great question. So CSS has the /*, and then it closes the comment with */. Right. So anything in between these two asterisks, this /* will be a comment. When we start learning about JavaScript, JavaScript has a // comment as well, because this is technically a multi-line comment. Right. I could comment lots of things out. I can put in background color blue. Anything between these two elements, the /*, and */ or star, that's going to be commented out. But CSS only has that type. This // that we'll use in JavaScript does not work. Go ahead. You muted yourself, Selena.
I like the comments in CSS to compare what things look like without having to erase all the code.
Yep. Yep, and it's a useful tool exactly for that reason. You can comment out giant chunks of. I can come in here and say, I'm going to comment out everything, and our page goes back to being plain, right? Because I don't have a closing comment. So that's a real quick way to do it. There's another technique that I'll use occasionally. If I put this back, actually, let's take it all out. Right. We've now got our header up here. Another thing you can do is you can just come in here and make this property invalid by just changing it to an X. Right. So if you just want to quickly, any letter in here would do, because this is no longer a valid property. Right. It's not correct code, but it quickly turns a single property on or off. Right. And so generally, if I'm in here and I say, let's turn this off. Right. So we don't want the font size to be 15. If I come in here and I say font size with an X in front of it, or with it could be any letter, right? A, B, C, right? This turns it off immediately because we're now invalid code. So in JavaScript, if I want to just comment out a single line, I would do // that comments it out in JavaScript. But in CSS, you have to come in here and add, this valid format. That's too many letters to type, so I'll just come in and just hit a letter, right? Just to turn it off. What did I do here? So this is the formal comment, and then you have the option if you're just turning things on and off, you can just make the property incorrect. Okay. There's a few other types that you need to be aware of. There's an arrow pointer, right? So if I do a greater than sign, it's saying this is going to look at a header that is directly beneath as the next element, the thing, right? So you notice this went back to small. It's because it's not direct descendant. I don't know how that works. Let's look this up. CSS selector. Let me pull up a reference. Probably use this wrong. Selects all P elements where the parent is a div element. Yeah, that should work. Oh, because we have should work. I know it's wrong. But in general, This is a way you can reference a child of a specific element. And then if if we're at W3 schools, these are all the different types of selectors that you can have, right? So you can even look for elements that have a specific attribute. We'll use this attribute thing pretty often when we're working with inputs, right? So if we wanted to get an input that had a name of email address and do something different with that, we would use that type of selector. So let me show you a quick example. Let's make input type equals text, name equals email. Well, let's use our correct email type. Right? So input type equals email, name equals email, and we'll say value equals ERH at the clubhouse. Right? So just like we saw when we were playing with this yesterday, we now have an input type here. But if I wanted to, let's make 2 of these. So we'll have a second one that is type text, just for the sake of argument. Not an email. All right, so we have 2 elements in here. One is an email address, and one is not. We can come in here and create a selector that says input, and then we'll say type equals email. Right? Oh, we need to add our rules, and we'll say background color CCC. So now we've made just that specific element that has an attribute that matches email. We've created a rule for that. That's another pretty common one you'll do pretty frequently. You'll do this for, like, I want every submit button on the page to look a certain way. I want it to be blue, right? You might come in here and say input type equals submit, and we would say, background color blue, color white. Right? We don't have any submit buttons, but this would operate on just the buttons. Every other input would not be touched. Whereas if we used a tag specific input, like, hey, let's make all of our inputs blue, right? Background color green. Let's add an input type submit, right? Input type equals submit. Value submit. Right? We now have a button in here. The button is blue. The input that is not an email is green, and the one that is an email is gray. And we've done that all through rules that would have inherited from each other. But you can see that if we had this turned off, and let's add a multi-line comment, right? So if we just, let's actually do it at the bottom. That'll make more sense. So we'd come in here and we would do a tag level selector, and we say every input is going to be green, right? It's going to affect everything. It's going to affect buttons. It's going to affect, if you had a search box at the very top of your page, that would turn green as well. And so the specificity when we start talking about these selectors is really important to keep in mind as you're starting to design your product. You need to be able to say, all right, let's make everything green by default, but I really want my buttons to be blue. Right? And so as soon as this is not in a comment, right, now our buttons are blue. Everyone tracking? So that's another selector type you'll use pretty often, which is square brackets, and then any type of attribute you want in here. But we could just as easily have come in here and said type equals email, right? Because that is an attribute, right? We learned about this a couple of times next week. Each one of these elements in here is the attribute of that element, and we can target them using CSS. Okay, everybody tracking? Awesome. And we've covered nested selectors and multiple selectors. Selectors are the big one, right? If you're not able to describe which element you're talking about, you're going to struggle pretty often. But some of the tools that we have baked into our Visual Studio Code give us a lot of hints, right? So if I'm inside, I'm going to make this bigger so we can see it. If I'm inside this input type submit, this is the full selector path on down to get us here, right? So at the lowest level of specificity, I can just say, hey, this is an input. It exists as a child of div main page, inside body, hashtag cool page, inside HTML. So we could use, in theory, we could use this whole path to describe, this is the element I want. And so that's one of the tools that exists for us. If I click on a different one, right? Still gives us body, cool page, div main page, div content, h2 heading, dumb heading fun, right? It's just describing that, and this is a useful tool that's built into your browser. Almost all the time when I'm working on CSS, I'm going to start kind of big picture to small picture, right? So if I was going to go and design a website from scratch, let's take out some of this stuff, right? Let's take out everything. Right, so we've got our HTML structure here. I'm almost always going to start at the most important thing, right? What's the first thing I'm almost always going to want to do? Is I'm going to want to do a star selector, right? Star says, I want this to apply to everything. And I'm going to go in there and set some same defaults, because right now our page looks really, really ugly, right? It uses default fonts. I'm going to come in here with the star, with the asterisk star selector, and I'm going to say font, family, Arial, right? Or something like that, right? So now I have a prettier font, right? That's step one. Let's just set everything on the page to use a pretty font by default. Let's say, by default, yeah, that's it. That's a good one to start with. So we're gonna use a star selector to just set a font. Then I'm gonna come down here and I'm gonna say, for the body, right, the body of my page, as I start working my way down that HTML structure, I'm gonna go in here and maybe say, I want my background color to not be white. I want it to be just like a light gray, right? So EEE, right? So you can see now it's a little bit more pleasing. And I'm going to work my way down the list. But maybe also, we've got everything that's, if you look here, we've got a tiny little bit of padding in here. But what we want to do is just make that a little bit more apparent, because we're working on a nice web page. So we're going to maybe come in here and say padding 10px, 10px, right? And I don't know if you can see this, but we gave ourselves a little bit of gap. And I can show that off, right? I've increased the size of this gap. So I'm starting to structure the page from like everything on down to more specific as we go, okay? Then I would come in and I would start working on, okay, we're in the body, right? What's our first major content section? It was we've got header up here, so maybe I'm going to come in here and start working on a header. I want to make sure that that looks pretty. And I'm going to pull in the code that we built that was nice. Where was it? Let's just grab this one. I'm going to come in and say, I want my header to be red for whatever reason, even though I would never really pick something this gaudy in real life, right? And then I'm working my way down the document, adding expressiveness as I go, until we eventually end up with what we had kind of before. As we start placing elements around the page, you eventually end up with a website that looks like you want it to look, and has menus on the left and menus on the right and content in the middle. But I'm starting from, let's set a few rules on everybody. We want everything to use this really nice font instead of Times New Roman or whatever the default is on your computer. We want to use, we want a nice light gray background instead of white. You're going to start to introduce the rules that apply to everyone first, and then you're going to get more and more specific as you go down. Okay? Now, we've been working inside of week2.css. But we're on divs.html. So normally, if we open up our other files that we've been playing with, right? Let's copy our link so that we got it in here. Almost all of your projects, you're going to have a primary style sheet that is going to share. You're going to have one style sheet that is like every page on this project is going to have this style sheet. It would be brand guidelines, things like that. So you might have picked the background color, you've picked a font, everything looks good, everything is pleasing. Individual pages then would have their own style sheets to style content specific to that page. When we were talking about caching earlier, this is really where things start to get interesting, in that you can build this beautiful, big, complex website with a whole bunch of JavaScript files and a whole bunch of CSS files behind the scenes, and only the things that need to be sent for that request, like if our biggest file was our week2.css file, and let's say it's 700 lines long, I might have a divs.html CSS file, and I'd call it like divs.css, that is 10 lines long, because all it needs to do is style this paragraph in here to light yellow with a red border, right? So you can start to nest complex structures by including multiple style sheets down the page. Now bear in mind, it's going to include, it's going to follow the same specificity orders. So if you've got multiple files that exist, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble being like, why is this still blue when I thought I defined it as red, right? So it's going to follow that same order, where it's going to try to go from top to bottom in order of loading. So if you've got this is defined as a blue background in the first file, and then it's defined as a green background in the second file. The second file will load. But then it's also going to take all those specificity rules into account as well, where it's going to go from who gives me the most complete name of this element on down, right? Everyone kind of tracking so far. The one thing I skipped over. No, I didn't. I didn't skip over anything. We're good. Great. Anybody want to review any of the things we just talked about before we start talking about how to work with these properties and how to work with the different types of elements? There's a whole bunch of properties, and I just want to introduce you to a lot of the main ones you're going to use most often. No? All right. Anyway. All right. So what are the properties? Let's make this full screen again. The properties themselves, we've got a whole bunch that we're working on. Let's use our header as a great example. Is it still red? No, I think it's using this one. All right. So in here, we've already got two of the properties that you're going to use pretty frequently. There's a whole bunch of properties related to font, right? So it's going to control the size of the font, the color of the font, and as soon as you start typing font, your thing should start to tell you some of these options. Now, I'm going to be honest, if you're not working as a designer or a front-end developer, you're probably never going to use all these things. You can control, the slant of letters using this, right? So that would be under like font style or font kerning. Some of these things I almost never touch, but you should just be aware that if I need to know how to get there, it's the same argument as before. If I wanted to come in here and say, CSS, we'll search for this. We'll say font kerning, right? It's going to tell you this is the CSS font kerning property, and it's going to include the spacing in between letters, right? Then it gives you a way to try it. So you can say normal or none. It's hard to even. Picked a bad example. But W3 Schools is going to be a great reference because they're going to have every single property that could exist and the ability, just like with our other stuff, to play with it in a little in-browser editor. So the font list of properties is one you'll use pretty often. Specifically, I almost always catch myself using font size, whether I'm setting 45px like we did before, or the other one that you'll use pretty often is font family, where you're defining these are the fonts I want you to use. We use this up here. We said give us Arial. If that's not available, give us Helvetica. If that's not available, give us sans serif. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the values portion, how we can chain values together. But in general, I'll use font family, font size. Those are the big ones that I hit most often. And let's just change this to Courier New monospace, right? So now, if we come back over here, we will see that, we gotta take this out, right? Did I change this? No. Anyway, yeah. Font family. What are some other ones you're going to use? Color is a good one. Color is operating on the color of the font, right? So anything you put in here is going to be what this font is colored. And if we pull this up, right now it's black by default. And if I come in here and say this is white, now it changes to white. Let's just come in here and say not important. So we can force it to be. Monospace. I don't know why that's not updating that font. That's weird. Cool. Color changes the font color to white. The other one we've used quite a bit this week is background color, right? And so if I put in RGB, whatever, that's going to change it to a more pleasing light blue, right? Any number of, we'll talk about all the possible options you can put in here when we talk about values here in a minute. But background color is one I use pretty often. You also might want to do background image. And background image will let you import a file from somewhere else. So we have an image in here. No, this project doesn't have an image. Of course not. Let's bring in an image real quick so you can see how silly this can get. I am going to navigate to our folder where we have images, which I think is in here. All right, we got a cat's picture. Let's bring this cat's picture into this project, and we're going to come in here and say URL. We'll say images, image, cats. And so now, instead of having a thing, we've got a background. You can't see it really because it's a small little thing. Let's make it on the bottom. That'll be easy. let's just say the body gets a cat's image, right? So now we've got our cat image as the background for this page, right? There's a whole bunch of cool stuff we can do with images, and we'll probably play with that around a little bit today because stylistically it's a really nice way to inject an excellent look and feel. A great example from that is my portfolio page. I've got this beautiful desert scene in the background. You'll use images pretty often like this to really just thematically set a tone behind the scenes. Okay? And so now we've got a really ugly cat image in the background of our website. Another property you're going to use all the time is, this is kind of two properties in one, padding and margin, right? And so padding is the extra space on the inside. So if you think of this box, this is a blue box, this header that we're working in. Padding would be all of the extra white space that is there. So if I come in here with padding and I say I want to have 50 px padding on the top and 100 px padding, right? Now you can, oh gosh, that made it so ugly. Let's make it 10 and 20. 20, right? So now you can see we've added extra white space on the inside where that content goes around the thing. Margin is the opposite, which is everything, it's the white space around it, right? So if I come in here and I say margin 20px, right? Now you can see that I've added, you can see the gray of that main content area is spilling through because I've said, give me a little bit of extra space around me. Margin is like, this is my personal space out here, and then like the space inside your body is padding. Everyone tracking with that? What else do we use pretty often? Oh, border, right? So border is a, you have a whole bunch of options here. You got, border top, but generally I'll do border, and I'll say 1px solid, and then a color, like green. Okay. So now I've added, well, let's make it bigger, right? So we can make this a 3 pixel wide border, and now you can see we really have a very strong border on this element. And if we inspect this, and we come down to our little style looker, we can see this is the margin. It's highlighted as I scroll over it. The border is this, it's 3 pixels, and the padding is 10 pixels and 20 pixels on the side, okay? And then the content itself is 762 by 74, okay? So inside your Explorer, when you're inspecting elements, at the very bottom of the styles page, you can kind of mouse over and see the relationship. Margin is the outside bit, padding is the inside bit, there's a border, and then there's the actual content itself. Another one we played with this today, right, is float. Right? The float property tells it to leave its normal boundaries of, like we were talking about in the structure of our document, it goes from top to bottom. So if we put a div up top and a div in the middle and a div in the bottom, by default that's the order it's going to load. So when we're in here looking at our elements, and we wanted to make this navigation element go to the left, we floated it to the left. We said, leave your normal spot and just squish over to the left, or go up until you can't go anymore. So that's the float property, and we use that pretty often down here, right? Float down here. Other interesting properties that you're going to use pretty often is height, right? Which, as you'd imagine, defines a height, and we can put any element in here, 100 pixels wide. We can set a width, 100 pixels, right? A lot of these choices break the expected normal flow. Like we remember this is a header, and we remember it's display. It's a block type of element, so it's going to take up all the space it can. But by declaring a height and a width, we're saying all the space you're allowed to take is 100 and 100. We are constraining its space through this style declaration. Okay. Great. Great, got that. What else do we want to talk about? Yeah, I think these are the main ones. We're going to learn a little bit later when we start talking about how to like really lay out this page to be responsive. There's a whole bunch of like flex types of things that you'll use, but you can almost build just about any website using these properties: font, background color, font family, font size, color, padding, margin, border, height, width, and float. But between those like 7 properties, you can build just about anything. Okay, there's a bunch of other complicated things. How many properties are in CSS? Did we learn this yesterday? How many CSS properties are there? Right? There's 520 things you could theoretically set with CSS. I have probably used 60 of these in my entire 20-year career since CSS has come out. You don't have to know everything, and unless you're a designer and you're trying to do something very technical and esoteric, you probably won't touch 50% of these ever. But you just need to know that they exist, and if something comes up, a lot of these properties, so for example, when we're learning about font size and font family, these count as individual properties, but there are other properties that are like font itself that let us use multiple properties at one time. So I could do font. I almost never use this, so we're going to have to look this up together. W3 Schools. Here, let's go to this one. CSS font property. Right? And this would be like an example of the shorthand that you can come in here and say font, italic, small caps, bold, Georgia serif, right? We're combining a bunch of those different properties together in one single line. So when I'm using border, right, for example, border is a great example of this. And I type in border 1px. Let's make it, we have border down here already, right? So I'm doing border 5, let's make 5px solid green. This is an example of a shorthand property because behind the scenes there's also border top 10px solid red, border left 20px solid silver. But I can combine all of these, rather than doing 4, the top, bottom, side, left, and right, I can combine that into one single border thing, which is going to say every element in this border is going to be one thing. And if we load this over here, yeah, we should see we've got this weird, you can kind of see it's starting to create an effect. Let's pick something other than silver so it's easier to see. Let's say black, right? It's starting to create kind of like a 3D effect here, right? We can do some 3D effects just with the border property by making it look like it's coming out or going in to the page. So sometimes you'll want to use these properties by themselves, and a lot of times, especially for debugging purposes or quickly getting things done, you'll use something like border pretty often. Padding and margin are the same way. You can come in here and say margin top, 300 px. Right? We're gonna push that element way down the page because we've said we've got all this extra margin up top, or if we needed extra margin on the bottom for whatever reason because we wanted to have extra spacing. Now it's here, right? All this extra space was created between this, and if we inspect this element, you can now see that there's this one. We can now see that there's, when we hover over it in this little menu here, we can see there's 300 on the bottom. And so it lets you visually see the representation of what you've done in CSS into how it actually looks in the browser. This is going to be one of your best friends, especially as we explore CSS this week. I use this all the time, even today, right? But that's just me. Cool. Any questions about properties? We kind of covered a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to start diving into the values next, and I really want to make sure that we have just a chance to digest this before we move on to all the different ways, because you're seeing me putting a whole bunch of shorthand stuff in here. I'm putting in color names versus we've used before, like instead of green, like FFF, right? Putting in actual color codes. We've also done, you can see right above, RGB 15. So each of these properties has a whole bunch of different ways that we can change the value. And I'm going to tell you the ways that I use most often, but I want to expose you to some of the other ways that you'll see it throughout your career. Anyone have any questions before we move on? Anything at all? Okay, cool. It is 6 o'clock. I suggest we take a 10-15 minute break, get ourselves a drink, walk around, stretch a bit, and we come back ready to just dive into values. That'll probably take us 45 minutes to an hour just to explore all the different value types, because each one of these properties has its own special value. And so I want to just make sure we're really thorough with the values time, okay? So 6 o'clock, see you at 6:15, and come ready to use your big brain. The recording, everyone can see the screen hopefully. I remember to share it this time. We're good. Important to note on W3 Schools, there are a ton of properties we just did not touch, right? But over here on the left, when you're in the CSS subsection, you can click on any one of these is a full list, right? So all the things we've been talking about, border left, border right, border, you can click on any of these and play with it inside the reference. So like animation, for example, I click that. You can see how to use this animation CSS property and how to make it work and do cool things. So I would encourage you, especially over the next couple of days, we're going to have some homework tonight that has you actually putting some of this stuff into practice, especially the ones we focused on today. But I would encourage you to just at least glance through this, read through a few of them that look interesting and catch your eye, because you will use this pretty occasionally, or at least you need to know how to find this and reference it quickly. So on to properties. The first one that we've talked about a couple times, we've just been using it organically throughout the last week, is colors, right? So there's a bunch of different types of colors and a bunch of different ways to use colors. Let me make this. Let's try and. Gosh, I hate that everything's big. So named colors. It's stuff like this. Background color blue. There are a whole bunch of named colors that CSS knows about, and if you just start typing in your browser, you can see this color. You could also search Google and say CSS color list. You can say sea green, save this, and if we viewed our page over here, you will see that this page should have, we changed it down here, so let's delete this. Right. You'll see that now it's sea green. There are, I don't know, like 100 or something named colors, and if someone ever says, make it blue, make it sea green, make it foam green, right? I think that's one of the options. Shell green, right? All of these colors are called named colors. The other way that you can change these colors, and we saw this a few times as well, is RGB codes. RGB is kind of an industry standard for describing what a color looks like out of the other colors it's made of, right? So R stands for red, G stands for green, and B stands for blue. Go ahead, Gregory.
What if there's a color they're not registered yet onto the to the program you're using, or you need to update your color and registry?
I didn't really understand the question. Can you restate it?
Asking like, let's say a customer requests a color, but not but your program cannot list that color.
Okay, if we're talking about named colors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or a color just been brand made, or recently just been made. Cause I know that some color has been made recently in the past. I forgot was one.
That's what we're going to talk about right now, actually. So let me just so we have some easy way to reference all this. Let's take out all this margin and stuff. So we're just looking at one nice simple fun with what we did with tonight. And so we're going to take this out too. Right?
Can you also mix colors in your text?
What do you mean by miscolors?
Mix the colors together.
Oh, yep, that's gradients. We'll get to that in a little bit. All right, we're going to go over. So Gregory was kind of asking, like, we've got all these named colors, but what if the color we want to use is not in here? Well, one of the ways we would do this is with RGB, right? So RGB says, give me a mix of red, a mix of blue, and a mix of green. So 255 is the highest number that could be in here, so we would do it like this. RGB 255 is white, right? So if you mix perfect red with perfect green with perfect blue, you're going to get white. The opposite of 0, 0, 0, right, is black, right? So if I save this, black. Generally what you'll do, especially if you're working with a light color scheme, is you'd start with a bunch of 255s, right? And if I wanted to make this slightly more blue, I would just decrease these values a little bit. So if I wanted to say the red is 200, the green is 200, and the blue is 255, you're going to get like this pastel purple. Now inside of our editor, we've got this little thing that pops up every once in a while and annoys me because I can't figure out how to get it every time. We get a color selector. And you can kind of see, as we're changing values in this color selector, that the RGB values are changing behind the scenes. So if I wanted to make something super duper blue, I could do 00, 255. That's the same as using the named color blue. And then there's any range of blues in here that we want. Over on the left, this is kind of the actual color tone, I guess is the right term for this part of the slider, where let's say I wanted to make it red, right? It's the same thing, right? The R value would be 255, and the other two values would be 0. And as we move ourselves around this color wheel, or this color gradient option here, the values are changing behind the scenes. Now, we're getting this in our editor for free. But there are a bunch of tools on the internet that's like RGB color picker, right? You know, there's one built into Google here, right, where we can play with these values and it's going to tell us the RGB. Is everyone following along? RGB is this, where we're defining the actual number value of the RGB. Yes? Cool. Now, there's another thing, and that is, what do we have here right now? Great, so we got a crazy red. If I do RGBA, the A stands for alpha, so that's like the amount of transparency that we have, and that's a value from 0 to 1. So if we put 0, it's going to be fully transparent, and if we put 1, it's going to be not transparent at all. So if I put in here like 0.55, right, it's going to be lightly transparent, or kind of right in the middle, right? 50 would be exactly in the middle. And if we're in here with the color picker, you can see that with this slider here, right? It's the one directly to the left of the thing. So if you wanted to have something that kind of showed the background through, right? If we had, so we got our cats back here. A great example of this, we have this cat picture in the background. What was that element called that wraps everything? Main page. So we can come in here and say, main page, right? That's going to operate on our main div. And we're going to say background, color, RGBA. What color is it right now? Something, let's just say 0, 0, let's say 255, 255, 255. And then we'll say we want it to be 0.5. Right, so now you can see, well, let's make it even more. Let's say 7. Let's do 2. So now you can see this cat image has started to bleed through that background because we made this element specifically slightly transparent. And we can control the transparency if we use the RGBA type of color. Got it? The other type of color we've used pretty frequently, if we come into this one again, is we're using hexadecimal color codes. This is almost always what I'm going to use. So you saw me put in things like FFF. That is the exact same as if I had put RGB 255, 255, 255, right? Hexadecimal is a type of counting system that goes from 0 to F, right? It includes some numbers in there, or some letters in there. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F, and then it starts over again. So when I do F, it's really saying 255 because behind the scenes, this is actually FF, FF, FF. So it's like 6 digits. But if I was to select, if I change this here with the color picker, right? I get the same kind of concept in my color picker here, where I can see the relationship between white, which is a bunch of Fs, and black, which is a bunch of zeros, and every small gradient in between. Each character set, the first 2, the second 2, and the third 2, whether it's a letter or a number, if we think of it spaced out like this, right? This is the R value, this is the G value, and this is the B value, right? So RGB, you can reference that by hex code. Oftentimes when you're working in an office environment or you're in your first job, people are going to give you color designs by just literally handing you, here's the hex color code, okay? This used to be like the primary thing. I would only ever use hex color codes, but I've slowly started to see RGB and in some cases named colors every once in a while starting to make an appearance in a day job, right? It's just really going to depend on how the color was defined. So if it's somebody who's designed something beautifully from Photoshop, or if you're working at a company that cares about design quite a bit like Apple, they might actually just specify this color that we actually care about is this RGB code and this alpha code, because the color itself is going to also depend on what's bleeding through behind it, right? So a great example from up here, yeah, let's do it here. So if I was in here and I said, our background is gray, right? And we went 255, 255, 255. Well, let's use a color picker. So if our color was really blue, but we had some transparency, the actual color that we care about might be some shade of blue that includes what's behind it, okay? So how you get your colors is one of the types of properties you're going to use all the time, right? So whether you're using hex codes, whether you're using RGB, RGBA, or using one of the named colors, those are the 4 main types of color, right? So we've seen this in a couple of our other examples, right? We did border. The first property value in border is the size of the border, 5px. The second is what type of border we're doing, whether it's solid, dotted, dashed, and we'll talk about that in a minute when we get to borders. the third argument in this element is the color code. So we could just as easily, we've got RGB 1588 123. So I can come in here and do 0 0 C, right? And it's going to create, now I've got a blue border, right? If we took out these crazy ones that we added. So anywhere that a color can go, you can interchange what type of color you're going to use, whether that's RGB, RGBA, hex. There might even be some other types, right? Nope. So yeah, named, and then RGB and hex, right? So that's colors. Any questions there? You're going to have a lot of opportunities, especially in today's homework, where we're going to ask you, use a named color or pick a different color from a list, right? Like you can use all these tools at your disposal, whether you're coming in here and using an RGB color picker from Google. Another way that there's a whole bunch of websites that are like beautiful CSS color combinations, right? And it'll be people that have put together a list of colors that work really well together, and they're going to give you these color codes, right? So it'll be like this, a bunch of swatches, right? If you've gone to a paint store and you look at a bunch of different little swatches of color, that's kind of what you'll see pretty often in design, where they'll say like, this color goes really well here with this color, which goes really well here with this color. So as you start thinking about theming and branding of your websites, these types of tools are really useful. And just depending on who is giving you that theme or who is giving you that content will generally influence, if you're going to use a hex code. Like, I wouldn't go and try and find what this is in RGB, even though I could switch it to that, right? I can come in here at any time and say, in the Google, I could say this purple tinted gray here. I can come in here and paste that code in, and there's my RGB value. If I wanted to paste this into the RGB function, I can use that exactly here. So there are ways to get to RGB, there are ways to get to hex, and then some of the other numbers that you might see, which come in here, CMYK, this is very common in the print industry. So if you're working with a company that like works in magazines or Augusta Chronicle or some of these places locally where they're actually using printer or like ink to actually print stuff onto paper, they might use this type of code, CMYK, right? So that's something you need to be aware of. This exists, and even though we may or may not ever use this code in Google, if you're working for a big company that cares about making sure their color schemes match, you might be given this color by a designer and say, make our logo exactly this color, and you have to be able to know how to go and convert it to hex. Okay? What was your question, Andrew?
Do you ever have to worry about copyright issues with colors?
Mm-mm.
No.
Colors are a statement of fact, right? So you cannot copyright any color. Now, where you can get into issues sometimes is if, like, for example, you're going to use the letter F and you're going to color it a blue, right? The color blue that is specific to Facebook using the letter F might be a trademark of Facebook. But if you wanted to use the letter F and color it with red, right? Even if it looks kind of similar, that's generally enough to get you out of all that legal gray area. Now, you could be sued for anything in theory, so I would generally lean on the side of like, if you're going to design a logo that you want to stand out, don't make it look anything like an existing logo, right? But as a developer, the color itself is not copyrightable. Some of the things that you may occasionally run into, especially in terms of like design of elements altogether, is that a whole bunch of color combinations together, like Facebook is a great example, where they use a specific set of blues mixed with a specific set of grays and a specific set of whites, and the page structure is put a certain way. That might be, that could fall into some trademark issues where they're saying you're trying to replicate the look and feel of a product. A lot of companies are very strict about their brand guidelines. They're like, this is our shade of green mixed with our logo, mixed with our background color. And they might take you to court, or in most cases they'll send you a cease and desist and be like, you are infringing on our design. And in which case, most of the time, you're always going to want to talk to a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what I'm saying here, right? So the cease and desist part just means stop it. So change the colors, change the design. If you wanted to fight it in court, that's entirely up to you. But in the context of being a professional engineer, just avoid all that nonsense altogether and just do your own original work and try not to be influenced by outside things. Like if you really like the way Facebook looks, you can build a better version of a social media network or a social network without using their colors, without using their fonts and stuff, for sure. All right, so that's colors. Let's talk about units now. We've used units quite a bit in this example, in all of our examples today. You pretty frequently will see me default to my old. Come on, stupid thing. Let me drag you. Oh, goodness. All right, there we go. This is an example of a unit. This is an absolute unit. I'm saying I want this border to be exactly. Let's drag it back. I want it to be exactly 5 pixels wide. Right? I can do 10 pixels here. I'm saying whatever the browser wants to do, I am telling it stylistically to use my exact measurement. Okay? There are a whole bunch of absolute values, and I'm going to just briefly touch on all of them, but in general, when anyone tells you to put something absolute, you're almost always going to use pixels, px. Okay? Now, using absolute units will very quickly get you into a lot of trouble, as we kind of saw with our example website we're building over here, right? I made these absolute, and so as I stretch the page and as I move things around, it might not display the way that I expect it to display because I no longer have enough pixels to include that content. And so we're going to learn about relative units in a little bit, but in general, relative units are a very good way for you to size and position things so that it flows properly regardless of what screen you're on. So as we started getting, like, way back when I first started, all I ever used was pixel units because I just knew that everybody was going to be on desktop. That is no longer the case, and most of your users, especially if you're building something that's faces the world, they're going to be using a smartphone, or they're going to be using a tiny little iPhone, or maybe they're on a big iPad or some kind of tablet. And so the difference between an absolute unit and a relative unit is going to be in how you implement it in your product. So that one is like I'm telling it what to do, and the other is like I'll let you decide what to do based on the screen. Okay, so we've been using absolute units all over the place. 10 pixels, that's the main one, right? So if we got a border that's 10 pixels wide, it's always going to be 10 pixels. Other references in here, I think if we do here, yeah, we can make this 10 centimeters, right? So we can use physical real-world units. So 10 centimeters is obviously huge. Let's turn that off. Let's make it 1 centimeter. I have never seen anyone do this. A possible exception would be if you were building something that you wanted to build it as a tool to like make a measuring stick, right? So I can maybe come in here and say that we want here. Let's as a great example, let's come in here and say this is our header, and we'll say div id equals ruler, right? And we'll come in here and say like, hi, I'm a ruler, right? You might come in here and say div id ruler. And we're going to add a little space. This looks nice. And we're going to come in here and say, I want the width of this background color yellow, right? Because we learned about colors. We'll say height 200 px. We want it to be, no, that's too high. Let's do 120 px, right? And then I'm going to come in here and say the width of this ruler is exactly 12 centimeters, right? So now, if I was to hold an actual physical device up to this page, it should be exactly 10 centimeters. If I went and found an actual image of a ruler, like with the dashes and stuff, and I said, hey, apply that as a background image to this ruler element, then I would be able to use this as a ruler and hold physical objects up to it, right? I could hold my phone up to it and be like, how big is my phone, right? Because we're now telling this measurement that is an absolute measurement to be this far in centimeters. The same thing would apply with IN, right? IN is another absolute measurement. So now, this is actually, if we keep scrolling, this is exactly 1 foot. And I'd be willing to bet if I took my tape measure out and I measured this would be 1 foot, right? 12 inches. What are some other ones that we might use? I had a few examples written down. PT and MM, right? PT is an old one that means points, right? And so if I come in here and I say 12 point, right? That's pretty small, right? Points are a small measurement, right? So 120 points would be that. Another one you might see is millimeters, right? If we were making a small ruler in the metric system. Aside from the silly example of I want to have this match a physical piece of dimension, right? Almost always when I'm using an absolute size, you're going to use px. Okay. Let's add some margin around here so we get some spacing. Margin, and we'll do 20 px. Right, so we'll give us some space. So this is our little ruler div we're playing with here, right? Let's talk about relative units, right? So relative is one of the more common things that you're going to do forever, right? So instead of doing height and width, doing px, we might come in here and say a percentage. We want the height to be 50% of the space that's available. Here, let's leave the height the same because it's easier to play with width. So 50%, right? This is going to be 50% of the box that it is inside of, right? So right now, this isn't actually 50% of the whole page, though it will kind of still behave the same way, because it exists inside the parent of main page, right? This one. So if we change this to, all right, so it's a little bit clearer, right? It is going to take up 50% of this box. So one of the common things that you'll do is you'll use percentages to say, I kind of want this. You know, we were talking yesterday about these menu item navigations, right? We said the width is 200%. I might come in here and say the width is going to be 30%, right? And left navigation, instead of this width being 200%, we're going to say 30% here as well. And then the content, we're going to say, kind of 90%. Or no, not 90, 60, right? So that this acts a little more graceful. Now, when you're using percentages like this, all of the stuff around the element also applies in its calculations, right? So we've said this is 50%. So if I inspect this element, right, and we scroll down to this thing, we've said it's 50% of the size, but it also includes 20 pixels of margin, so 20 on the left and 20 on the right. Okay, so even though it's 50%, the entire size of this element is 50% plus 40 pixels. Right, so if we took out the margin here, which is up here, right? We took out the margin, we make this 0 pixels. Now it's exactly 50% of the element that it's inside of, right? And you can see it's flush, right? So it's 50% of the element it's inside of. And that's one of the reasons why our elements down here, the navigation that we were just playing with, where we made it 30%, 60%, 30%, is because we've got some margin and some padding built in around these elements that is causing it so that even though we think we've got enough room, we used only 30, that's 90% of the total space, we have extra padding or extra margin that is causing it so that this bottom element still has to drop down. All right, so if we made this, let's make this 40. Right? This should be enough. Yeah, so now we have elements on our page that stretch and grow as our page does, and it won't drop down until it absolutely runs out of space to display both. So only until the browser realizes that the content is now going to start to get destroyed will this drop down. Let's take out our terrible inputs because we don't need these anymore. Right? So you guys can kind of see the relationship between an absolute and a relative. The relative is going to let us gracefully move up and down as we go. So there are some other relative things that you will use pretty often. And I might actually have to look these up because I don't use them that often myself. I am not a super good designer. So let's look at CSS units. All right. And so these are the absolutes, right? It's telling you how much, these are the ones we were just talking about that I don't use very often. EM is relative to the font size of the element, right? So this is a really cool one, which is as the size of your font changes, the size of the element inside of it changes, or that is containing it changes. So how can we do this with our ruler? What does our ruler say? It says, hi, I'm a ruler. If I come in here and I say the width is 20 EM, right? Let's make this so that we can see it while we're playing, right? So the width now is 20 EM. That's because the font size is, let's say, let's make this real small, 8px. Right? You notice that the width has now shrunk because the font has shrunk. And so this is pretty common when you're dealing with a lot of typography, is that you want the content, like as we were working with headers and stuff, you might come in here and say, for a heading box, right, something with big content, we would want to be able to make sure that there's enough space around it, right? So 32, if I made really big font, now you can see that this actually goes, gosh, I grabbed the wrong one. This actually goes off the screen when we're smaller, okay? You probably won't use it with something simple like the width of an element, but where you will probably use EM specifically is spacing between letters, right, or spacing between lines. So if we were talking about one of our ULs, right, we have a bunch of navigation elements in here. So let's make one. And we'll say something like line height is 10, well, let's say 10 EM, right? Let's just see what happens. Now we've added all this extra space around, in between the lines of our elements, right? Line height is another property that you use every once in a while, but most of the time I don't. But it's one to be aware of. But if we wanted to just have this really, really be excellent and graceful, this would change with, font size is, let's say it's 32 px. It's going to preserve that spacing in relationship to the size of the font that's going with it. And that works whether I'm pressing Control minus minus or Control plus plus to make my font bigger or smaller on the screen, right? So that's one of the type of relative units that you're going to play with pretty often. What is another useful unit? X, current font, rarely used. Yeah, so CH relative to the width of 0. I've never used this before, but we can play with it. We can say the font size of this div element is 3ch, right? We can come in, so ch is one that you'd use maybe for font size. It's going to multiply it by the size of the 0. A lot of these relative units have very specific use cases, and that's one of the reasons why you don't use them most of all. But REM is one that you'll use pretty often, and that's specifically around the size of the viewport, right? So, or the size of the root element. So you can define your root element to be like the body or the HTML when we were going up here and we were doing a star, right? So you might want to define a base style that all the rest of your styles inherit the sizing of that thing, right? And you would do that with REM. The other two that you're going to touch pretty frequently is VW and VH, right? It's going to be relative to the size of the viewport. So this is really when things get interesting in terms of the relationship between if you're on mobile, if you're on a tablet, if you're on desktop. So if we had if we can assume, here is a great example, right? So if I come in here and I click this little toggle device toolbar, you could see that if I pick, an iPad, for example, the iPad size is 768 by 1024. So in pixels, that's how much space you have. But if we define our CSS rule to say, I don't care percentage-wise where I am, but I just know that whatever this viewport width is, that is going to be the number I'm going to base my calculations off of, right? And we can play with this in here if we wanted to come in here and say, the font size is 20 VH. If I look at this in developer tools, right? So now I'm in an iPad, or if I move myself into a iPhone, right? This font, in theory, is gradually reducing itself to not take up as much of the space, right? Everybody tracking? Absolute is I'm telling the browser, make it exactly this size. Relative is where things get really interesting, and you're going to use it a lot for fonts, and you're going to use it a lot for width and padding and all those sorts of things, where you want it to gracefully adapt to what is around it. Cool. Anytime there is a measurement in any of these things, so we were doing padding before, right? You can mix and match these units, right? So here we've turn this off, right? So we added a padding in our body, right? That's this 10 px and 20 px. If we made this 70, right? We're increasing the distance between our center content div and the edge of the browser, right? That's the second number, and it happens both on the right and the left. Any of these numbers is interchangeable, so I can come in here and I say I want my padding to be 10%, right? And so no matter how big my browser is, it stretches that padding to fit. You can see how the padding has increased because we made it a relative unit instead of an absolute unit. Whereas before, when we were absolute and we said 10px, it's always 10px. Okay? And you can mix and match any place that has any type of unit like this. Margin, padding, height, font size, every one of those is replaceable with any of these other things, whether it's percentage based. We can come in here and let's use a silly example. Where is our header? Yeah, so we can say font size instead of 45px, we can say 30%, 20%, right? So now it's relative. I have this here. now it is relative to the size of everything else. Okay. Let's make it 80%. Cool. Everyone following along so far? Those are units, and we're going to play with those quite a bit more, especially today and tomorrow in our homework. Control S in the wrong spot. Okay, units. Great. We kind of briefly talked about the fonts. We talked about font family, right? That's one we use where we're picking, we're saying, try to use this type of font. And there's a whole bunch of them in here. There's a big list that you probably can use, but in general, the ones to be aware of is the sans serif, right? So sans serif means, here, let's see if we can do this on the body where it's easier to see for everything. So rather than this, let's say sans serif. Serifs are the little swirly things that go with letters, right? So if it is a font like Times New Roman, right? Let's change this to serif just to show off because it's easy, right? You can see they've got little ornamentations here, like little swivels that come off the L. Let me make one of these bigger. Give ruler. Font size, let's make this 64. We're going to make this real big, right? Can you guys see that there's a little squiggle coming off here? There's a little decoration off the R. That is a serif. And so in typography, serif fonts are ones that embrace that like squiggliness that adds new context. But sans serif means without, and that is exactly what you expect. There's none of those little squigglies sticking off the end. Okay. Another type of font family is monospace, right? You're going to use this pretty often if you're playing with code. It means that every letter is going to have exactly the same distance, right? The other types of, like when we're in serifs, right? Sans serif, right? You see how the text kind of squishes itself together? It's because the letter L is shorter than is less short than the letter E, right? You see it takes up less horizontal space. But in monospace, and we're going to use this, I mean, this is in your code editor as well, right? Like monospace wants to give you the ability to have things lined up. So every letter will take up exactly the same amount of space. Serif, sans serif. So in general, those are the three major types. But when you're in the font family function, you can also specify exactly what font to use. So we can say, I want to use Arial as my first font. And if Arial exists on that system, it's going to use it. And it's going to fall back to the second font. We had it as monospace before, but we have Arial, so it's going to use Arial. But if we put in something that the browser doesn't have, right? Arial is not a real font. It's going to default to that second choice. You can put any number of choices in here. So we could do Arial, Helvetica, right? And then monospace. We have Helvetica, so Helvetica took over. If this was wrong, right? It goes back to monospace, and I could put in. We can put it in quotes as well, right? Times New Roman, right? And Times New Roman shows up. So generally what you'll do, and what you'll see with the font family command, is a whole bunch of options that are common across most computers. So if I type in Arial, let's just start typing, right? So Arial, Helvetica, sans serif, that's a really common combination because those fonts exist on both Windows, Mac, and Linux. But it always can default to whatever sans serif font exists on the computer. You might pick something like Franklin Gothic Medium, Arial Narrow, right? So there are a bunch of different choices of that are really common in this industry that you'll see time and time again. Now, when you're building stuff just for yourself, I would just urge you to like play around with fonts, find a font that looks good, and stick with it. But generally how this interacts with you in the real world is that your company will say, our font is this. And they'll say, it'll be some kind of, maybe it's Arial Narrow. Let's take out this one, right? Maybe Arial Narrow is your default font for your company. That's what your brand guideline says. You'll use whatever the company's specific font is, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Other interesting font properties. There is a place where you can get all kinds of cool free fonts, right? So Google, if we search here and we say Google Fonts, this is a resource you should get really comfortable using, especially when we start designing our portfolios and when we start designing some of our projects later in the year. There are a whole bunch of free fonts that Google has made public to the entire world that look neat, that you might want to put into your product to just inject some life and make it look cool and stand out from everyone else. If everybody built every website using just Arial or Times New Roman, everything would look the same and look terribly boring. But you can come in here and find a font that looks cool, and you'll say Open Sans, for example, or maybe I want everything to be Papatalia, right? It's got all these cool letters in here. If I wanted to use this in my product, how do I add this here? It used to tell you, it used to give you a little code snippet to add it. Select this style. Yeah. So if I include this style sheet on my page, then I can use this in my font family. So I can just copy this from here. I can paste it into my browser and on the page I'm in. Right. So we want to come up to our heading, and let's add it above the other one. Right. So now we've got this Google font because they gave us the code to use. It is pulling that content. And then I can come into my style sheet and I can come in here and say, our header, or let's use our ruler here. We can say font family. What is it called? Pataya. Right? And so now when I load my page, it's using this really cool thing that I just got off Google. It's embedded that font in your web code, so that even if I don't have this font on my computer, it's going to first download it, and you can kind of see that if we view source, and I click on if I click on this link, it's going to tell you what it's doing behind the scenes. So it's saying, hey, load this font face. This is CSS as well, right? So we have the @fontface command, and we have the ability to give it a URL to tell it, hey, go download this font in this format and use it up ahead in the future, right? And if we look at our network, right, when I load this page with the network tab open, I can see that it downloaded this style sheet that had those fonts, and then it goes and grabs the font that we're going to use. So it's patched up this font file and included it in the web content, so that all of your users on every browser can see this font as you intended, right? So that's Google Fonts. This is a really useful tool, and I use it pretty often, right? There's a whole bunch of fonts in here, and oftentimes if we're talking about some kind of design, you'll want to pick one in here that is available from Google. All the stuff that we're doing with the Google fonts, you could do as well, right? Using this same sort of code, right? So if you wanted to have a file on your computer, or if you wanted to buy a font, like you can purchase premium fonts, you can include that premium font in your web directory, and instead of saying the source URL is this, you could say, you could have a fonts directory in here, right? Like just in here. New folder, fonts, right? And then you can load it locally, just like we did with a video, right? It's the same as whether we choose to embed a YouTube video or we choose to host the video on our server and send it out ourselves. All that Google is giving us is a really nice way to jump through that system so that they can host it. Then it talks about caching as well. The more people that are using these fonts, the more likely it is that your user's browser won't have to go and download it because it'll already be in the cache. Okay. Another one that you use pretty often, and we've kind of talked about that today, is the font size. What? Cancel. No. Stop clicking the stupid button. Font size. This takes a unit, right? So it can be any of those units, whether it's relative or absolute. Generally, I'll use pixels for fonts. I know that this is kind of like old bad practice, but I'm like, I want my biggest thing to be 32px, and I want my smallest thing to be 8px. Behind the scenes, that's what the H1 through H6s are doing automatically. So if we go back to our the page we were playing with yesterday, which was index.html, right? Oh man, I shouldn't have added that there. Now it's going to be ugly. Let's go to index and take out our style sheet. Cool. So we've got our heading here. If I right-click on this heading and I go to inspect, you can see that it really has a font size of 2em, right? So that is going to be relative to the other things in the thing. And we can come in here and we can bump this up. We could say 3em, or we can come in here and say font size 3em, right? So now it's even bigger. By default, each one of those styles that we were playing with over the last couple days when we're building HTML, H1 is the biggest, H6 is the smallest. It's doing that by just setting a font size so that when the browser loads something that hasn't been styled with CSS, it behaves with kind of a sane default behavior. Everyone tracking? Font size. Line height, I just showed off. line height lets you set the spacing in between lines, right? This works on any type of element. So if we pull up, right, we've got a P in here, a paragraph. Gosh, why is everything so weird? All right, so we have our paragraph here. We did it with the UL, but I can come in here and say, hey, for every P, I want the line height to be 10 px. Right? That means that all of this stuff got scrunched up to be 10 pixels. If I made this, 30 px, right? Now there's extra space and buffer between those lines. Generally, when we're talking about things like line height, this would be a great use of relative. So we might want to do 1.2 em, right? So the line height will be tied to the size of the font. So if we came in here and we said font size 32 px, right? It gives us a graceful expansion of that line height based on the size of the font. And if we made this 1.4, right, so even bigger, you can see that it kind of gracefully goes along with this. If we drop this down to like 16, right? So you can see right now, kind of the size of my cursor is that area. Now it's even smaller. Cool. Everyone tracking? Font weight and font style. Font weight is another interesting one. So we were talking the other day about using a strong tag or using something like bold, right? Font weight, you've got a few options in here. One is normal, so this is just me, whatever it does by default, do that. You also have bold, right? It's going to make it bold. And then there's another one that's bolder, right, which makes it even bolder. And then font weight. Let's look up all the options that we could put in here. Font weight. Let's go down to font weight. Right. Yeah. You can also put in numbers as well. So we could use absolute numbers. Right. From 100 to 900. And it's going to tell you some of the examples. 400 is the same as normal. 700 is the same as bold. 900 is the same as whatever. So I can come in here and say, I want my letters to be super duper thin. And you can see now that they are, right? And if I wanted to make them bold or normal, they'd go back to. It's hard to explain with this one. Let's use our div ruler. So we'll say font weight bold, right? Now we've made these thick letters, and if we go font weight 100, now they're thinner. Right? You see the relationship there where we can change these values around. And then the last one is font style, and font style has a couple of different options, which pop up as soon as we pull up this thing. Italic. This would make something. This would make it as if we were using the emphasis tag or using the I tag, the elements we learned about last week to make things italicized. Right? We could do the same thing in here. Font style italic. Right? And so now our paragraph tag is going to appear, this paragraph of text is going to look like we had gone and made this wrapped with an emphasis tag. Let's actually take left navigation. Where are we at? Oh, with UL. Let's take this out. This is driving me crazy. All right, good. Everyone following along so far? So that's really a lot of the font controls you're going to use. There, as we saw over in W3 Schools, there's a whole bunch of things you can do with font, right? Kerning, font variant, like we can change it to say, hey, everything that is in here in this paragraph tag, let's make it caps, right? So we can come in here and say font variant small caps, right? And now it's changed everything to use small style capital letters, even though the content behind the scenes, if we copy and paste this, is lowercase letters, right? So there's a lot of cool transformations you can do with the font line of properties. Okay, and you'll often see this. You might go to a website that all of their headings, right? You might come in here and say H1, H2, H3, right? H4, H5, H6. We're going to do font variant small caps, right? Just so that every heading on the page uses all capital letters. You've probably seen something like this pretty often. This makes it so that if you're building like a blog or something and you wanted to make sure that every blog article had all capital letters all the time, but you didn't want to force your users to actually type that in, you could use this font variant to override it. So no matter, I could have typed in all lowercase letters and it's still going to show up in capitals. The same is, think if you use text decoration, right? We can do something like underline, right? Which is going to add an underline, even though we didn't put in a bold thing. We didn't include anything to tell it to do so. So there's a whole bunch of decorative things you can do with fonts and with text that is really powerful. It can transform completely what you see on this page. That's fonts. Height and width, we've been talking about this pretty often. I would encourage you to start playing around with, especially today when we go into the homework and as we start working on our portfolios, like play around with the difference between absolute and relative units. In general, if you're doing something structurally, like we were building these left and right menus and putting a center content thing, almost always you're going to want to use relative units for all of those. But you would use absolute units for things that you knew for sure were never going to be affected by the size of the page. So there are occasions where you use both, but height and width are really important. There's a few other things in terms of setting height and width to auto. Right, this comes into play specifically around when we're playing with things like menu items, and we want to have a menu over on the right and a menu over on the left. Auto is a special one. Let's see if we can find our navigation. Yeah, left navigation. So we've got width here as 30%. We can make this auto, and what that is going to do is it's going to take up as much space as it thinks it needs. So we can make all of these things be auto, right? Width auto, right? And so now these are kind of small, right? And that's because that's all the space that this element has required. So there is an auto option in width. We didn't talk about it as a unit, but it's one that self-calculates its size based on how much space it thinks it needs. Now we can, obviously this looks bad, right? And our fix to this would be to say, hey, let's give ourselves a padding of, 5%, right? Something like that. And so now we've got an auto thing that is going to take up as much space as it needs, but also try to maintain a little bit of padding that will also grow relatively. So we can start to mix and match and combine some of these positional elements so that our page will grow and change with us regardless of our device or regardless of our screen size. Okay. What's another interesting one we want to look at? Yep, relative. We talked about relative versus absolute. There are a few min options, right? So every time we define a width, any one of these commands, height, width, padding, almost all of them have a min height and a min width, right? So we can go min width. Let's say we've selected auto, but let's say the min width is 100 px, right? So we can say no matter what, even though we want this to shrink and expand, at some point it's going to fall below 100%, and it's not going to let us. It's a bad example because I didn't make it big enough. Let's make it 200. Right? The min width is 200, right? So now even though it's shrinking and expanding, at a certain point it no longer can go below that value, and it's going to force it to move to another location. So that's a really good way of saying, hey, this menu must have at least 200 pixels in it, or this must have this amount of space so that my layout doesn't get destroyed. I want it to be flexible by default. I want it to expand and contract. But as if I load this on a mobile phone, this menu, if I'm on a phone, right, will drop down below. So being able to play with mins is a really powerful feature. Now, the same is also true. Every one of these elements has a max, right? So I can also go in here and say max. Let's say max width 250 px, right? So now it's never going to go above that. Right? No matter how much space it goes, it will stop growing at a certain point. Let's do this with a P. It's probably easier to see. So let's say P max width. Let's say 100 px. Right? So the biggest this paragraph will ever go, regardless of how much page I go, is 100 px pixels. Right? You guys understand that relationship? Almost all of these things have a min dash, and you can set a minimum, and a max dash, and you can set a maximum. Especially important for the positional things that we're playing with, where we want to be able to say, hey, this is a menu, it's really important. I want to give you as much or as little space as you want, but if I don't have enough space, move it down somewhere else. Okay? Alright, cool. Borders. We've talked about borders quite a bit. Borders are an interesting one because most of the time, as I described here, almost always I'm going to use a single value. So this is our P. Let's do it with the ruler. That's a fun one. We love our ruler element that we just created. Right? We're going to say border 1. All right, let's make it easy for us to see. 5px solid green. Right, so we got a big bright green border. Okay. The first element here is the size, and this can be any of those units we've talked about. The second thing is we put solid, but it does not have to be solid. I just use solid pretty often. If I do dotted, right, that is an option. And if I do this green, it's going to give us dots. There's one that is dashed, and now it's larger dashes. What are some other types? Let's look this up. I most of the time just use solid, but border. Yeah. Here's perfect examples. So this would be a solid. This is a double border. If you use double, this is a grooved border. There's a ridge. Inset, right? So when we're looking at input type elements, really behind the scenes, what they're doing is they just automatically applied an inset, right? So when we have our inputs, which we had on, where's it at? Oh, it's not on this page. When we were playing with inputs yesterday, you know how it shows the it's kind of like an inset box. Let me see if I can make one real quick for us to play with. Gosh, I hate this big, everything big. I'm gonna make this smaller for myself so I don't go crazy. Right, we're in divs. When we're in here, hi, I'm a ruler. This is my div. I'm gonna come in here and say input type equals text. ID equals style example input. Right. Right. So by default, let me go back to that previous page. Oh, we still got styles in here from when we made it green. Oh, we're getting ourselves in trouble. All right. So by default, it looks like this. It lets you know it's kind of a thing. We can control this. If you see here, if we come in here and we say, input, and we say border 1px inset blue. Right? So now when we load this page, let's do 2. Right. So now you can see it. We've changed the style of this input completely, so that it looks quite a bit different. But we can also make this dotted. So now our input looks weird like this. Okay. You see it's got dots instead of the kind of the 3D looking input element. What are some other ones? Outset would make it look like it's standing on top of the page, like a platform. So let's make this 6. Outset. And now you can see it's got like a little bit of a darker color on the bottom. Let's do it on our ruler, so will really be fun. So outset. Let's make this 10. Let's make it really, really noticeable, really pop. 20px. Okay. So we were kind of playing with this on accident. We were playing with top and bottom and stuff. But the outset thing is going to do the same thing, which is the top and left side of this border are going to be slightly lighter in color than the bottom and right of it. So it kind of looks like a 3D effect. Okay. Does everyone see that? So border, that's border. This is the default. And when you put it together like this, where you say, this is the size, this is the style of border, and this is the color of border, it's going to do it to all 4 sides. But we also have the ability to say border top, and it uses the same type of format. 1px solid blue. Border bottom. Right? We can do border left and border right. Right, so all of those are going to have the exact same value format as regular border does, but most of the time you're just going to use the shorthand and say, handle all my borders yourself. I want my top to be the same as my bottom and the same as my right and my left. Right? Everyone tracking so far? Cool. All right, we played around with this already. Background colors. We played with, making things gray, We've been doing this all afternoon, right? And even some yesterday. Background color is that thing. Background also has its own shorthand of this, so we can go background right? And we can say, let's look up the correct syntax here, so we make sure we're all tracking correctly. Background. And so we can combine these things together. So we can say background, FFF, URL, and then cats, right? Image cats, JPG. And so it's going to give us a white background, but with cats as the image. Okay. Background. We learned how to make it load an image, right? So we can. The way to do this is with the URL, like it's kind of like a function, and so this just takes any type of URL we want. It can be a file that we have locally hosted on our computer, or it can be a fully qualified web address. Right? So we could have pasted in that image. The other day we were talking about this string is really long. Is there any way to shrink it? Right? This could be a big long gibberish string that ends with whatever.jpg. So, and we kind of saw that when we were looking at the source code of what Google is doing, right? It's using the same method for the URL here, right? So it's saying, load this file from Google. Load this on behalf of Google. So this URL syntax, you'll probably see in other places. How do we show, let's see, background properly? You can define multiple images just by adding commas. So like we have background image URL. If we had another background image up here, we could put a comma and say, here, let's find a quick image. Lizards. Image. We got a weird lizard here. Copy image address. And I can come in here and say, we want to load cats and we want to load lizards. So what URL? Boop. Oh, that's terrible. That's going to give us a big, long, crazy one. Let's go right to it. Copy image address. Record. Of course, it's going to be bad, right? That's probably going to break. Yeah, so we have, we've loaded the lizard, and in theory, it would have loaded the cats as well. Any questions about background image? There's a whole bunch of things you can also do. You can say no repeat. We can do some cool things to make them have like a parallax view. How would we use this in an example? Let's see. All right, so we'd come in here and we'd say background repeat, and we'll say repeat on the y-axis. It's going to be hard to show off because our image is so big. Let's see if we can find a small image. Actually, we'll do that after the next break. I'll try to find some assets that we can use and play with that really show this off. Maybe there's a reference on here. Let's go to background repeat. Right, they usually have pretty good examples built up already. Yeah. So you see how it's got this this paper image in the background? They have said repeat Y. We can also say repeat X. And if we click run, it's going to repeat that image on the x-axis versus what it was originally, repeat y, which was on the y-axis, right? But we can also just put in repeat, and it's going to repeat it for the whole page. So if you got something and you want to have like a textured background or something, this was really common back in the day, you would put in a very small little image, like paper.gif, and then you would use the background repeat to have it go over and over and over again. Cool. Background position, this is another great one. Let's use W3 schools because they're going to have really great examples. Background position. Yeah, so this lets you specify where on the page this image is going to be loaded to, right? So they've said no repeat, right? We learned about that, but we could also come in here just for the sake of reinforcing. We could say repeat. Right? It's going to use that image everywhere, but we want to change that back to no repeat for the sake of the thing. We're going to say the background position is center, right? There are other options that we can put in here, and let's just check and see on this page. It's going to show you the options, right? You can do left top, left center, left bottom. All of those things are options for us to choose in here. So we can say left, bottom, and if we click run, now it's over here on the bottom left, right? Right bottom, right? So you can use a CSS image that is loaded in your code, and you can play, like if you wanted to have a watermark on the bottom right of your page, regardless of what content is over there, you could say, this is always going to be in the bottom right bottom. Okay? And we've said that it's background attachment is how you've told it it's fixed. So if we took this out, what would happen? Let's see. Yeah. So that is going to the right bottom of the size of this page instead of the size of this viewport, right? So when we were talking about HTML, right? Like because HTML is only going to use as much space as it needs, there's not a lot of content on this page. So this image is going to move itself down the page attached to the content. But when we say background attachment fixed, right, it's going to be fixed to the viewport, right? So now it's going to be all the way down here, even though all the content stopped way up here. And if we wanted to use an inline style as an example of like how we are doing this, if I come in here in the body and I say background color blue, right, just for the sake of argument, it is including the entire page, but normally it would have stopped right here. Style background color white. Right? Because when we did not have this command in here, the content ended up there. Got it? Everybody following along? Cool. Yeah, so that was fixed. We could have also made this be scroll. How can we show this off easily? Let's take out this color. This is driving me crazy. Right. Let's put in a bunch of stuff in here. Keep hitting Control S. Right. How can I? We probably need a bunch more stuff, huh? Let's grab a few of these. Let's add some stuff in here. Yeah. So now it's at the very bottom of the scroll bar. And then the other option is local, which I don't know what it's doing. We can read it and we can figure out what it does. We'd have to go to background attachment, and it's going to tell you what those options mean, right? So scroll is the background image will scroll with the page. That's the default value. Fixed is that it's not going to scroll. It's going to be locked in place. Local is that it will scroll with the contents of the elements that it's in, and then you have initial and inherit, so that if you were actually cascading and you had a whole bunch of these rules to find, it can read from the ones above it. Okay. Awesome. It's 7:18. We've kind of covered a lot of stuff. The last thing we're really going to cover tonight is talking about gradients. Gregory was asking earlier, how do you make things look like they have multiple colors? Gradients is the answer to that. And there's a lot of fun tools. We're actually going to play with one that lets us do gradient development, and it'll tell us how to implement that in CSS. So we've got kind of one of those types of widgets. But before we dive into this, I want to just take a quick break, go to the restroom, walk around, stretch your legs. Does anyone have anything they want to talk about before we go on break? Or any questions or things you'd like to see more of? Nope. All right. It is 7:20. Let's come back at 7:35. So it's 15 minutes from now. Okay? See you in a bit. Everyone can see my screen, yes? All right. So the last thing we want to take a look at today specifically is the CSS gradient options. So gradients are kind of crazy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share this link out to everyone because gradients are a really fun and powerful tool. But as you're going to see when we start playing with this, there's a whole bunch of crazy options that make this a little bit difficult to work with. And so what you generally want to do is work with a tool like this that will let you pick your colors based on a number of different criteria. So all of the things we were doing before with color selectors, we can do here, and it's going to give us this crazy long string that we're going to include in our code. So if I come here where we have header background color red, if I place this in here, we're going to see that our background color is now this pleasing red to blue transition. Okay, and all of the things in here are things that you should recognize. We're saying this is a linear gradient. 90 degrees is the angle at which the gradient is turning. So in this case, it's straight up and down. But if I change this to, let's say, 180 degree, right? Now the gradient is going to go top to bottom, right? You can do any kind of degree gradient in here you want, like, let's say, 36, right? Some kind of weird 36 degree. So now it's kind of at a slanty angle. Then we pick the colors that we're going to use in the gradient and what percentage that color starts. So in this case, it's starting at the very left, 0%. Then at 48%, we're going to introduce another color. And then at 100% on the far right, we're going to introduce our third color, right? You can continue to chain these types of things over and over and over again together. So I can come in here and say RGB A, let's say 145, 145, 230, and then 1. And now I've introduced a fourth color that you can kind of see in here. The reason we want to use a tool like this is that a lot of these gradients, you're never going to want to, gosh, where am I at now? Yeah, a lot of these, a lot of the complexity in here is going to be something you're going to want to do iteratively or with like something that you can quickly visualize, right? Doing it with sliders is a really good way to go. And this lets you quickly, every time I click, we can end up making really weird, wacky color combinations that don't make any aesthetic sense just by clicking and dragging and playing with these numbers. And you can see that our CSS that's generating is growing exponentially as we continue to add these elements. There's also some really cool things on this page. There are some examples of some really weird gradients you can do. So you can do a radial gradient. So instead of being linear and going from one to the other, radial just means it's going in a circle, right? So we have this option here, and this is the actual output of the gradient. If we were to include this on our page, right, then it would look like that. Right, so it creates a little gradient in the middle, and then everything radiates around it from the outward in. And that's right here. Right? So it's saying the blue is on the outside, and the red is on, the blue is on the inside, so it starts at 0 in the middle, and the outside, the 100%, is everything around it in a circle. And if we made this header, like let's force height to be 300 px. That's probably not enough. 500 px. Right. You can see more of that circle shape that is with that linear gradient. So this is a really powerful tool, cssgradient.io. I'm going to share this with you all today so you can play with it. It's a really fun way, especially for backgrounds and things, so that you can add just a little bit of excitement and color to your page. So let's take this one for example, and let's set that to our body. Right. So instead of cats, we're going to do this pretty gradient. And now you can see that behind the scenes of our page, there's a really interesting color pattern that is going on, right? So this is going to be a useful tool for you, especially when you're trying to make things look lively and pop. Okay. So today we've played with a whole bunch of CSS properties. We've played with a whole bunch of CSS styles. Is there any question before we move on to the next part? Is there anything you'd like to see more of? Is there any questions you have about the things we've looked at today? You're going to get to practice this quite a bit tomorrow using a lot of the same elements, the CSS selectors and elements that we learned about today. But for now, I wanted to focus on, is there any questions with this before we start something slightly new? You guys understand kind of the power of how we can chain different styles on down a page. So we can say all of our divs have a gray background, but this div specifically has a border, that sort of thing. We understand the difference between an inline style, an embedded style inside the page, and an external style sheet. Yes? Okay. All right, so what I thought would be really fun to do with really like our last hour is we've been playing in this nasty page where we're just throwing stuff in here, but what I thought would be cool is to start from the beginning, like even including stuff from last week. We're going to create a brand new project. We're going to create an HTML document, and then we're going to do some styling on it in a way that is not wild and obscene like this, right? This is a whole bunch of crazy nonsense. You would never, hopefully, build a page like this unless it's an April Fool's joke, right? So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say new window. I'm going to close this old one because we don't need it anymore. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so that we can see it. And I'm going to open well, actually, we're going to start from git bash. That sounds like fun. So I'm going to go back to my CBC 12 folder, and I'm going to do make dir, and I'm going to call portfolio. actually, I think it'd be fun. Let's make ourselves a website for an activity tracker. So we're a tracker, not tractor. We're going to make an activity tracker, kind of like Andrew was doing the other day with logging his fitness and stuff. And we're going to use some of the elements like HTML inputs. We're going to make lists. We're going to make tables. That'll be a fun little mini project that we can do in like 30 minutes, right? So we're going to call this activity tracker. All right, we'll just call it activity so we're not typing a bunch of stuff. So now we have an activity folder. If I type ls, you can see it's in there. CD activity, right? Now, there are a couple different ways we've learned to make a project for Git. We're going to go the computer first, GitHub second model. So we're going to do git init dot. Right, so I've got an empty repository here. We can see that we're in the main branch. And so what I'm going to do, just to like kind of simulate how it would work in the real world, is I'm going to first create a README file. Actually, let's open it up here. I'm going to open this folder, CBC 12 activity. So right now, we have nothing in our Explorer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a folder called CSS. I'm going to make a folder called images. I'm going to make a folder called JavaScript, even though we're not doing JavaScript yet. And I'm going to make a file that says readme.md. So remember, the readme.md file, this is Markdown. I'm going to come in here and create a top-level header, and I'm going to say activity tracker project. And then I'm going to put a paragraph that says, this is a fun activity tracker to help me stay fit and lose weight, right? And then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, I'm going to give myself a extra line, and then I'm going to say made by Eric, right? So I've got my first file here. I'm going to go into my source control. I'm going to add it by clicking the plus sign, and then I'm going to say initial entry with readme. All right, I'm going to push that. I'm going to click the checkbox, which will commit it. And then I'm going to go over here to the dots. I'm going to push it. So I have nowhere to push it to. So it wants us to add a remote. So now would be a good time to go into GitHub. And let's just close all these other crazy tabs we have open. Right? I'm going to create a new repository. And I'm going to say this is activity. Cool fitness and activity tracker. Now, it's public, but because I have an existing repository already, I'm going to leave everything here unchecked. I'm not going to have it add a README file, otherwise my README file will get overwritten or I'll have a merge conflict. So I'm going to create an empty repository. GitHub is going to do that. I'm going to grab this SSH information right here, right? And I'm going to come in here and I want to work inside the terminal that exists inside of my browser. So I'm going to come in here and click New Terminal. By default, it's still creating stupid old PowerShell thing, so I'm going to click Git Bash, and I'm going to close that PowerShell one. And I'm going to come in here and type, does anyone remember the command to add a remote repository link? Wendy, I know we just did this today with you. What was that command?
I had the same problem again, and I kept trying to figure out what it was. I know it was git rm something. I can't remember.
So git rm would be to remove a file from Git, but we need to add the link that tells us, hey, this project is attached to GitHub. Does anyone remember?
I know it was that link that you told me at the top of you or something.
Go ahead, Gregory.
Is it get back? Is it get remote origin? Not original.
Origin.
Yeah, origin, and then the I think it's -m in the code, or it was code.
Is that correct? Does anyone know if this is the right way to do it? If I did it like that? We're missing something. First off, it is remote add, because we're telling it to add an origin, and there's no flag here. So if I do git remote add origin, and I put this in here, now if I do git remote, right, it tells us we're linked to origin with GitHub, right? So now I have my changes. I just tried to push it from this menu. If I push it now, it's going to give me a little warning saying, hey, this branch that we have here on our computer doesn't exist on GitHub because GitHub is empty. But I'm going to say, yes, I want to publish this branch. So I'm going to click OK. So going forward, that's never going to happen again unless we create a new branch, right? So I can verify this by going back to GitHub. And if I reload here, you can see this is that markdown file we just created. You'll also notice, and we didn't cover this last week when we were learning about Git, none of these folders that we made, CSS, JS, and images, exist here, right? Why do you think that is? Any ideas?
No idea.
Okay.
Is it because you added CSS, or you started doing CSS, or added the rest for you?
Nope. This is a Git specific weird thing that you just need to be aware of. By default, when you're adding and working with repositories, if I was to go in here right now and say Git status, it's going to say everything is good. Git doesn't care about folders at all, but what it cares about is files in folders. So if I was just coming here and make a, let's just call it activity.css, right? As soon as I do this and type Git status, it's going to say there is an untracked file now because it knows that a file exists in a folder we're not watching. So if I do git add CSS, right, and I type git status, Andrew is going to be like, I'm done with this class, and I'm going to walk away and look at cats. But now we can see that there's a file that needs to be added that didn't have before, right? And so we can use this method up here. If I stage this change, adds empty CSS file, and I commit that and push it. Now what's going to happen is when I reload GitHub, you can see there's a CSS folder, but it's still it doesn't have the JS folder and it doesn't have our images folder. By default, Git doesn't care at all about folders, and the only time it's going to start talking about a folder is when there's the very first time you'll put a file in there, right? Obviously, if we're doing brand new development like this, most of the time I'm going to have 10, 15 files that I've already created, or at least templates of, before I would go in and even check those into version control. And a great example of that, I might come in here and say, I know I'm going to want a JavaScript file at some point, so I'm going to make activity.js, and this is a blank file. There's absolutely nothing in here, but I'm still going to come here and check it in and say adds empty JavaScript file and push it. So now we're going to have everything except that images folder, right? Because we got our JS folder, it's got a file in it. We got our CSS folder, it's got a file in it. So the structure and stub of our new website that we're working on right now has some content that we have inside of our GitHub repository. So it's exactly what we have on our computer. It's the exact same as what we have on GitHub, with the exception of images, because that folder is empty. Okay, so we're all kind of caught up. We've got a README. What else do we have in here? Now, so inside this top level, because we are working with Andrew and we're working with Estrella and they're using Max, if we wanted to work on this project together, we need to add ourselves a .gitignore file, right? And yeah, so I accidentally put it inside of the JavaScript folder. But we're going to make a .gitignore, and we're just going to come in here and say, I want to ignore dsstore, right? And if I come in here, we're going to check in gitignore so that everyone that works on this project with me, when they pull it down from GitHub, they are going to have that same thing, so that Andrew, when he checks in code, it's not going to break our site and add a bunch of nasty empty Apple folders everywhere. Adds git ignore. Right? Check in and push. Okay, so we're all caught up. So now I'm ready to actually start developing with HTML. So the first thing I'm going to, I did it in the wrong spot again. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to click this little new file button, and I'm going to say I want index.html. Right, this is the first page people are going to get to. All right? Everyone tracking along so far? So this file exists now. If I type git status, we're going to see I have this brand new file. Just for the sake of making sure we're on the right page, I'm going to come in here in the bottom and I'm going to say git add index.html. So now this file is tracked, even though we haven't checked it in yet. I'm going to use my little handy dandy shortcut. I'm going to do one exclamation point and then hit tab. Now I've got the framework of a website, the outline or structure of an HTML document. I'm going to come in. God, stop holding. It's not that. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to change the title and say my activity tracker. Or maybe we'll call it fitness tracker, right? It's not just about activity. I maybe want to track weight in here as well. Maybe I can track my weight and make a cool chart later. Right? Another thing I'm probably going to do, because I care about style, I like it so that every element that exists is indented. So I'm going to come in here. Even though the body and the head are on the same indentation level as the HTML thing, I think it looks better like this. So I'm going to say, if I've got an HTML on the outside, I want my next tag inside to be indented one level. And then I'm going to come in here and make sure that all these things do the same. Okay? Next, because we just learned this today, I want to have my style sheet available in this project as I start coding. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say link rel equals style sheet. Right? And I'm going to say href equals CSS activity.css. Okay? So now my style sheet's in here. And if I pull this up in live server, Right, you can see I have a blank empty HTML page. It's loading my activity CSS, which is also blank. But what I'm probably going to want to do as I get in here is I'm going to make just the framework or the start of a website. So let's use some of those cool HTML sections that are interesting, right? I'm going to come in here and I'm going to use header, right? I want to have a header in here. Header. And inside my header, I'm going to put H1, because this is the most important thing on my page. I'm going to say my fitness tracker, right? H1. So I can verify this exists. If I come here, yeah, it updates automatically. I'm probably going to want to have a footer in this project, so I know that at the bottom of the page it's going to say stuff like, this was created by Eric, please don't steal my stuff, right? So I'm going to say footer, right? These are just some of the special HTML elements. Behind the scenes, this is still just a block level, a block type of element, right? I could have just as easily come in here and said, I'm going to do div ID equals footer. These are exactly identical. All I'm doing is just using some of the fancy new tags that we've learned about today. Okay. Up next, I'm probably going to want to make a div, let's do a section, and I'm going to say I'm going to give this an ID so I can reference it later. I'm going to say main, right? And inside my section, I don't know why indentation is driving me crazy. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say I want a navigation element. Nav. This is where I'm going to put my left menu. And then I'm going to want another section in here that is, I'm going to give it an ID of tracker, right? So my website now is going to have, let's say, nav here, main tracker. And all I'm doing is I'm putting in a little bit of content that lets me know what is going to go where, right? So I can come in here and say footer, right? Copyright me. Yeah. Okay. So when I view my page, you can see that I have a whole bunch of ugly, unstyled stuff, but it's all stored behind the scenes in our HTML in really nice, easy to use sections and tags and headers, right? So first off, I know that my nav is going to be a list of links, right? So I'm going to probably go in here and say, let's make this an unordered list. And let's add a list item, and it's going to say home. And maybe I already know that I want to have, maybe we'll make, instead of home, we're going to say this is activity tracker. And then in the future, I'm probably going to want a weight tracker. Right? And maybe I'm also going to want food log. Right? And so now I can see I've got a menu here. It's not put where we want it to be. It still looks ugly. Everything's gross. But this is the start of my structure. Then in here we got the main tracker. Maybe for the purposes of this, I'll put in a thing that says main tracker. Right, so we'll have let us know that we're on. We'll just name it the same, right? Activity tracker. Because as we're building this site for the first time, we're kind of making the assumption I'm on the main page, the activity tracker. So if you can imagine this is a list of links, this one is already clicked. I'm here, and I'm not on this page. I'm not on weight tracker or food log. Okay. And then probably I'm going to want to have, maybe we'll put in just some notes for ourselves so we know what to come back and do, and we'll just kind of do that using some of the tags we know we're going to want to use. So we'll have input type equals text, and maybe we'll say ID equals add activity, name equals add activity, right? And then we'll maybe want to have a submit button. So we'll do input type equals submit, and then we'll put a value of track exercise. So what we've just built basically is the start of an application where I'm going to come in here and say like ran 20 miles, right? And if I click this button, it's going to do nothing. We haven't built it into a form yet, but I'm starting to structurally put in the elements that I think I'm going to have on this page right before we go and start styling, right? And then maybe below this, right? Maybe I'll put in a little HR here. So we can give ourselves a horizontal line. And I'm maybe going to come in here and put a div, and I'm going to say div ID equals activity log, so I can reference it later. And I'm maybe going to put, maybe just to start with, I'm going to put another unordered list. And I'll put in a few examples in here, so I can say, ran 20 miles, right? I'm super good at running now. Maybe I do squatted 50, 145 pounds. Maybe we'll do like 10 times, right? So we're starting to build this out in a way that is really interesting and pleasing. Okay, now I think we've finally gotten to the stage where the bones of our website are built, and now it's time to go in and start styling it with CSS, right? So what I would probably do before I move into the CSS point, this kind of this framework that we've put together here of this page, I would normally take this as a really good stopping point as a developer and come in here and say, like, I have implemented fitness tracker prototype, right? So you're going to want to put a commit message in here that lets you know I did a thing at this step, so that I can go in here and push. If I come down here and I check git log, right, I can see this is kind of the flow of all the things I've done as I've been building this product. All right, let's look at it while we're big. All right, so the most recent thing is I implemented the fitness tracker prototype. That's our first HTML page. I added a get-ignore file. I added an empty JavaScript file. So you can see how Git, especially as we're working with teams, if Andrew was working on the food log at the same time as I am, right, he would submit a pull request, and I'd want to pull that in and be like, oh, that was a really useful feature. But we might be sharing the JavaScript file, so we might have to combine our code in a single file. Whereas on the HTML side, it's a little bit more cut and dry. Usually, it's usually going to be one person that works on the first version. Right? But we might have Leah. We find out Leah is this amazing guru of design. Or maybe Wendy is excellent at typography and she's really good at making things look fun and pretty. And so maybe we've got Wendy or Leah working on the design team, working on the CSS behind the scenes with us. And we're going to want to be able to incorporate those changes, right? So everyone's followed along up till now. We've got our HTML file. Everything is broken out in nice, clean, easy to use sections. And we can see that it's still super duper ugly. There's no style here, okay? So what I would maybe do at this point, if I'm working on a team, let's imagine that I'm actually Estrella, and Estrella has been picked to be our team designer, right? And so she'll come in here and she'll say get branch -d or -b. Oh no, excuse me. Get checkout -b, which makes a brand new branch. It's going to check out a branch and make a new one, and we'll say this is the design branch, right? So we've made this brand new branch, and now we know that we're in the design branch because it's here. It's also down here on the bottom left, okay? And she, for the first time, goes, oh, Eric already made this beautiful HTML file. I can style this and start to make this page look pretty. So she comes in here for the first time, and she opens up activity.css. And maybe the first thing she wants to do is like, hey, Times New Roman is the worst font in the whole world. We do not want to have this ugly looking nonsense up here. So I'm going to say by default, every element on this page is going to get the font family of, let's say, Arial Helvetica Sans Serif. And maybe she comes in here because she's a really good developer, and she puts in a note using a comment that says, we want to actually pick our product font soon, right? So we haven't decided or agreed to what our product font is going to be, but we know that we want it to not look like Times New Roman to begin with. Times New Roman, for whatever reason, is the default of everything, and you can now see in this branch, hey, we're using Arial, and this looks way better already. It's already cleaner. Then the next thing she's going to decide is, I don't want this product to be white. Maybe we've decided as a team, we want this to be cool and modern. We want to have a dark background. So we're going to say background color, and we want it to be not black, because that's a little bit too extreme. But maybe we come in here and we say, we want it to be a dark gray. And she comes and looks at this and says, nah, that looks kind of too sterile. Let's make it like 555, right? So that's still too light. We want to make this 222. And then she looks at this again and goes, I'm just going to pick a color using this color wheel here. And maybe she comes in here and makes it like a dark reddish color. And we're like, all right, that's a good starting point. But now we got the problem of our font is black. It's hard to read what we're doing here. So she might come in here and say that the color is actually going to be not quite white, but like EEE, right? Like so a real light gray, right? Now we're off to the races. We've got something here that is like, okay, we're working on a design here, and nothing is going to be finalized at this stage, but we're just starting to put together the building blocks of making this an interesting product. Okay? All right, cool. So we've got our body. We've got kind of a default looking background color. We've got a default color for our fonts. Everything is new and modern and fresh. But we first think, hey, we really want this menu to show up different. So we have put that in the nav element, right? That was what we used over here. So all of our menu items are in the nav element. So what we probably want to do is we want to just come in here and just start to put something in place so that we can start to visually separate these elements as we start moving things around the page. So maybe she comes in here and says, for the time being, I'm going to make this background color just look ridiculous so that I can track it. And so we'll say something like 444, right? So it's going to be a lighter gray, and we can see, oh man, this is a block. It goes the full distance. We probably don't want that. So we're going to say, I know that I need this to be a little bit smaller. So we're going to say this is 20% of the page. So we're going to do that by saying width 20%, right? Now we don't know if that's the right amount of size, but we know, hey, that's better. And then we know that we want this main activity tracker here to be to the right of that. We want it to be something else. So let's just, for the sake of argument, we'll come in here and say, what did we call this main section? We called it section ID tracker. So we're going to come in here and say section tracker. And we're going to tell this one, we want a width of, we don't want to probably do 80% because we know we're going to start adding some padding and stuff. So let's just start in the middle and say 70%, right? So we've still given ourselves 10% of the page to work with. And if we give this a different background color as well, just so we can start placing things on the page correctly, maybe we make this 777. And we know we're going to change these colors. These colors are not what we want. We're just changing it so we can start to visually see what does it look like when we've got margins and paddings and we start moving things around the page. And then the last thing, just so we don't lose track of this, we're probably going to come in here and say we want a footer. We have this already here. It's at the bottom. Let's maybe go in and say border, we'll say border top, 1px solid CCC, right? So it's like a light gray. And now we've added a border at the top of this just to visually separate those together. We could have just as easily gone in and put an HR in there, right? A horizontal rule in HTML. But we don't really actually want to have those separated structurally. We just want to put a border in. Okay? Now, how would we get this activity tracker to be to the right of this this menu? Now, there's a couple different ways to do this, but the first way that always kind of jumps to mind as the easy way to do it is we just might maybe say float left, right? And let's see what that does. So that definitely floated left, but it didn't do what we wanted it to do because the activity tracker is not floated left. What it did was it moved our footer up. So we need to come in here, and I don't know if you guys remember this, we didn't spend much time talking about it today, but whenever we got elements that are floating around and we want to preserve, we want to say, hey, don't float below this element, we're going to say clear and then both. We could have said clear left, we could have said clear right, but it's almost like 100% of the time when we're playing with floats like this, we're going to come in and say clear both, just so it says, hey, don't let my element that I've floated, and the float means, remember we're taking it out of the normal flow of the page was that the nav is up top, then we've got an activity tracker, then we got a footer. Float says, I'm going to control this some other way. Don't display it. Don't display it in the normal structure of just the default rendering layout. So what we also probably need to do is we probably need to float our nav as well. Right? So if we float left, right, what does that do? Yeah, there we go. Now we have done almost exactly what we were setting out to do in the first place. We've told the activity tracker navigation to float it to the left, and we've said, hey, float this to the left as well. All right, so now they're kind of lined up exactly like we want. But there's a problem here. We can see these are smushed up right on each other, right? That's because who remembers the command that deals with the extra space on the outside? What is
margin?
This? Yeah, margin. Yeah, margin is the stuff on the outside of this. So we probably, just for the sake of quickly prototyping a design, we're going to want to come in here and say margin left, and we can put in something like an absolute value like 10px, and we'll see, hey, that did add some space. That's a good start. But we probably want to make sure that this scales gracefully. So let's use one of our, let's just do 1 rem, right? And we'll see, yeah, that looks pretty good. Now, another problem is because these are floated elements, right? Our footer is smushed up on the bottom of this. So maybe we want to add a margin bottom as well, right? Margin bottom, 1 rem. The other alternatively, we could put a margin on the footer. We could come in here and say margin top, 1 rem. Right? And so now we got 2 margins, which probably isn't what we want. Oh, interesting. Okay, so when we've floated this element, we've cleared both. It was working correctly when we put the margin on the section, right? So margin bottom, 1 rem. but it wasn't showing up that extra spacing that we wanted when we put it on the footer. And I think that has to do with how we've been floating these elements. There's a better and more efficient way to like structure these things and move them around. We'll probably get into that maybe tomorrow, but probably next week when we start talking about Flexbox and some of the options there. But for the sake of what we're doing today, generally, you can almost always rely on this type of setup. And so we now see that, hey, this page kind of gracefully degrades, but what we also probably want to do is set a minimum width on this, right? Because we know that that's a problem. So we want to do min width, and maybe we give it an absolute value, and we say, or maybe we say min width auto, right? So the most this will degrade is, see, the content is leaving the side. So we probably want to come in here and say min width 150 px. So now we're being more absolute about it. Yeah, and that feels like that's more of what we want to do. So let's make this a little bit bigger, actually. So min width 160, and now if I'm in a small window, this activity tracker floats down to the bottom. But you can also see there's a problem here, right? When it floats down to the bottom, this element, the activity tracker, has padding still, or has margin, right? We gave it margin left, so this stuff doesn't line up anymore, which is kind of dumb. So if I'm still Estrella, I'm the team's best designer, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, let's do this the other way. So rather than doing margin left here, I'm going to go into nav and I'm going to do margin right, 1 rem. Right? So now, when I drop this down, everything works correctly. Except we don't like that this is probably smushed up like this, so this would tell me I probably on the nav want to do margin bottom 1 rem. And so now we can see, hey, this pretty gracefully scales depending on the size of the page, right? One thing I'm not crazy about is that there's this extra space over here on the right. We probably want to have that be a little bit bigger, right? So we probably would come in here and maybe make this 75, which would decrease that amount. Or maybe we want to make the width auto, right? So it's going to take up, Control S, right? So now it's going to take up as much space as it needs, right? That's not what we want either. So we would think to ourselves, we're probably going to want to revisit this later on, but for now, let's just make this 80%, and we know there's a better way, but we'll play with it later, right? Oh, so 80% is too big. Now it can't ever get out over there. So maybe we would just come in here and tweak this and say, let's make this 78 and see if that fixes it. So 78 would be if I'm on a really big monitor like I am, but as soon as I get down into like more normal person monitor size, it starts to break. So for the time being, let's say we're going to deal with this in a little while. We'll make it 60 because we're just trying to design the rough structure of this website. And we say, hey, this looks pretty good. Now, stylistically, some things that jump to mind. This is the main box where you're going to be doing a bunch of stuff. We're going to be tracking our exercise like run 10 miles, right? And we want to click track. I probably want to have this H2. Right, this is an H2 in here. Not have so much margin and padding, right? Or I think it's margin in this case. So I'm going to see what it is right now by inspecting it. And if I scroll down to the bottom, I can see it's got margin of 19 at the top and bottom. That's the default style of this H2 element. We say, that's probably not what we want. So I might actually come back up here to the top of my file, and I'm going to say, hey, we defined this default style for everything. But I also want to just kind of define some default styles for my H1s, H2s, H3s if I use them in this product. I'm going to come in here and say, I'm going to worry about margin on my own. So I'm going to say margin 0. Right? And now you can see everything is much more squished up. I would do this kind of thing pretty often if I'm building a brand new product. And to be honest, there's some really great existing libraries that I might want to consider bringing in. So there's one that's called CSS Reset library. So normalized CSS. This is a, if we look about it here, we'll look at the source. Right, so this is just a bunch of CSS rules that make all the browsers behave more consistently, and it resets a bunch of these things. So it's going to say, hey, I want my font size to be this, but I want less margin, right? Or let's, this is a bad example because this one's normalizing. Let's CSS resets. There, that would look like a good, oh, I went too fast. Tiny CSS reset library for modern web design. I might come and take something like this, and if I can find the file, Right? I might look at this file and say, does this do what I want? And if I look at the source and I pull up this CSS reset, it's doing a lot of that stuff. It's saying, go through all the elements that have a default browser style and remove all the margins, remove all the list styles. I'm going to control that myself. So oftentimes when you're working on a brand new project, you might use a library like this that is going to do exactly what we're doing right here, which is I want it to not do what it's trying to do on its own, right? So that I don't have as many things to fix and undo. These types of libraries are a really great place to start if you have an idea of where you're going. But for now, we're just not going to focus on that. We're going to say we want to take out all this margin. And let's look at our activity tracker. So now we say, hey, we actually want our activity tracker heading, right, in our section tracker. Maybe we do something like this, and we say, I just want to work on that one specifically. So I'm going to do H2. And I'm going to say margin, bottom, or let's just do margin in general, and let's add 5px around the whole thing, right? So I've added a tiny bit of space around the outside. But I also noticed that my input element here is squished up to the far left. So maybe the next thing I'm going to try is I'm going to go into section tracker, and I'm going to say, I want everything to have a nice, pleasant little buffer of space around there. Does anyone remember what we would do to add a buffer inside of an element?
Padding.
Padding, yeah, exactly right. It's the opposite of margin. So I'm going to say padding. I just want to give myself a little bit of space so that there's breathing room in here. And I say, hey, that worked exactly like I wanted it to, except now the padding of the box and the margin of this H2 are making this out of alignment. And that's going to drive me crazy. I'm a perfectionist. So I'm going to come in here and be like, all right, I know I don't need that for now. I'm just going to take it out completely. But I know I'm probably going to want to style something in here, so I'm just going to leave this selector empty. So now we can see it's exactly kind of what we want. And maybe we say, hey, this heading 2 that we have here, we actually want it to be text, align, middle, center. Right? We actually want it to be centered in the middle of this thing. And we want there to be margin bottom 5px, right? Because it's too close to our little inputs here, right? So this is a pretty good layout, right? We've got the structure of a design here. And since we're done playing with some of this stuff, maybe I would come in here and I would take out the background color, right? Because we know we didn't like that color, but it was just there to help us visualize as we're moving boxes around. So now we've got this pretty cool website that we built in just a few minutes. That is the framework that now we can start attaching JavaScript to. Okay, so I'm going to come in here. We made some changes in this branch. I'm going to check in our CSS and we'll say initial design, and we'll maybe say like feedback requested, right? Because we want our team to help us get better. And so we'll go ahead and push. It's going to tell us the same thing it told us the first time we did this. It's going to say in very small font, the branch design has no upstream. So that means GitHub doesn't know about this branch yet. Do you want to create it up there? And we just always say yes. So it's got this little blue arrow saying, hey, this is being pushed. And if we go into GitHub now, which was somewhere, where did we have it? Okay. If we go to GitHub, we can see design had recent pushes less than a minute ago. So if I'm Astray and I'm like, I did it. I've got a layout in place. Let's get this into the project and we can all keep working. We're going to use the pull request mechanism to say, hey, this is ready to be looked at. And so we'll say, I made the background dark and put the menu on the left and footer below. Take a look. Right? We're going to put some information here that's going to tell our team what kind of feedback we're looking for, and then we're going to click Create Pull Request. So right now on GitHub, we've said, I'm ready to merge this code in. Please take a look. If you remember on our local development computer, if I'm me and I don't have this branch yet, I'm going to do git checkout main. Right? My CSS still doesn't exist. For my version, that doesn't have the code that Estrella just got done slaving over for hours and hours, making a beautiful design for us. Mine is I'm still waiting on her. But I know she said, hey, this is ready to go. So I'm going to come in here and look at it. I'm going to look at the file, and she says feedback requested. Maybe I'm going to look at all the changes she made, and I say, oh, don't tell me stuff about this. I'm going to say, oh, okay, I see where you're going here. This is pretty interesting. I think it's at least good enough to, let's merge this in. I'll say, looks like a good start. I'm going to maybe leave a review on this. And then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, merge pull request. Okay, so all this is doing is merging her branch into main. So now her branch, we can delete the branch. It still exists, right? She might want to continue working in the design branch forever, for the entire length of the project as she continues to improve the design. But for me, I'm in main here. That's the one I care about because that's what we're going to put on our server somewhere. So it's merged in, and how I, as Eric, I'm like, I want to get these changes that we just checked in. I'm going to do git pull origin main. And so now all the stuff that was on GitHub in the main branch that we just merged in, I'm pulling down to here. And if we look at my version of the program now, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that looks pretty good. We're off to a great start. Okay? Now, obviously, I cannot tell you how to make things look pretty. I cannot, I'm not a designer. What we've seen here is exactly my format every single time, which is I'm going to change something a little bit and then try and tweak it, and then I might try 70 iterations of a color until I find something I like. There is a lot of great resources that you can definitely brush up on, and I would encourage you to do so, that talk about like really good UI standards. But a lot of the rules, to be honest, is generally around attention to detail. It's making sure things line up correctly so you don't have paddings and margins making things askew. It's talking about the types of fonts you're going to want to use. That are like, these big bold fonts are excellent at headings, right? But they're not as great if I was reading a bunch of paragraphs of text. I might want to use a slightly different font for my body text than I'm using for my headings. Okay, so that is kind of what would we spend on this? 25 minutes. We have built the framework of a product, right? And there's still a long way to go. We're still going to want to tweak this. We still need to build a weight tracker and a food log. Let's do that maybe next, right? So we have this index.html. We know this is our activity tracker. I might come in here and say, we're off to a good start with our design. Let's just copy this file. We'll paste one in here, and we're going to call this one weight.html. And then we're going to do the same thing. Copy, paste, rename, and I'm going to call this food.html. Okay. Then what I'm going to want to do, because I've got these two new files, I'm going to want to come in here and change these page titles, and I'm maybe going to want to go in this heading 2, right? I'm going to come in here and say weight tracker, right? And I'm going to want to come into food and say food tracker, food log, right? And then on each of these pages, right, it might have been a good idea to do this first. I'm going to want to come in here and do a href. I'm going to say food.html, right? I'm going to close that tag, and then I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to do the same thing up here with weight tracker. A href equals weight.html. And I'm going to come up here and do a href. And here's a cool thing. If I just do a /, right? Because our activity tracker is in index.html, this is going to be the same as if we sent a request that was empty. It's going to try and load that index file. So we can put this here. This works exactly the same as if we came in here and typed index.html. Okay. But I always like to just, if it's the index page, let's just make it a slash. Now, I have this on 3 different pages, and you'll see that this page doesn't have those links. This page doesn't have those links, and this page does, because this is where we put them. What I would generally do is just come in here, copy this, and paste it in all of those places, right? So now all 3 of these pages link to each other. Oh, I didn't save it. Figures I'd click the one that doesn't work. And then we see that, like, because these are all links, right? One common user experience element that you're going to probably see pretty often is whatever page you're actively on, you maybe don't make that a link, right? So if we're on weight, I'm going to come in here and take this out. Right? On food, I'm going to take this out. And on index, I'm going to take this out, right? So whatever page we're on, it's going to be not a link, right? So if I save all these files, Control S, Control S, now as I'm moving along, you can kind of get a sense of progress and moving, right? Activity tracker, weight tracker, food log. Everybody follow along? Now, one thing that would drive Estrella crazy, now we've added links to this page. There weren't any links in our template that we gave her, and she comes in here and she's like, oh, cool, we got these pages now. So let's add all this stuff. We're still collaborating with a teammate. We're going to say adds links to other pages this application needs. Okay. So I'm gonna stage these changes by clicking the plus sign. I'm gonna commit this with that message. I'm gonna push. Okay, so now main has all those pages. Maybe Estrella, she's still in here working in get checkout dash B. Wait, get checkout design, because design exists. And maybe let's do. She's pulled down this. Oh yeah, this doesn't exist. So get checkout main. Right. She's in here and she sees, hey, we didn't have links before, and these links are purple, and that's stupid. Like, this should be purple. It does not match my design, but we still want to have it look like it's a link, right? We still want to have it be underlined. We probably want to have like a light blue. So we're going to come in here for the first time. We're going to style our anchor tags. So we're going to say A. By default, we want to say the color is. Let's just do like a nice light blue. So we'll do RGB. And as soon as this comes up, maybe we do something like this. Right? So it's a light color. If we save it, great. Now these are blue. But the problem is we don't know if we've been to one of these pages before. So one of our other selector options is A with a colon, and we say visited. Okay? And so now we can say, if I've been to one of these pages, if it exists in my browser history, we're actually going to make it, oh, we forgot our semicolon there. We want to make this a different color. Let's make it yellow, just so it's really apparent that that's what we're doing. Okay? Oh, we save? Yeah, there we go. So now all these are yellow, because we've been to each one of these pages. But someone who's new to this website might see this as a light blue. Some websites will make a link. There's some other things we could do. If you've been somewhere before, maybe you've made the link bold, or you make it not bold. If you haven't been there, it's bold, so it shows up as like, hey, click this. Those are stylistic choices that you can make using this kind of mechanism. But now we've got a really nice way to say, hey, this is a link, I can click on this. But the cool thing is, this is going to be the style for links everywhere in our page. Anything that is an anchor. So if we came into index and we went in here and said, copyright me, and we say ahref equals mail to, right? Because we want people to be able to contact us, tell us when our product is broken. We say erh at the clubhouse, right? Email me, right? When we're on the main page, specifically the activity tracker, look, this one is blue. It's a beautiful blue link that says click me. And if I click it, it's going to try to take me to my email client, but I don't have that configured for this browser. Cool. I mean, this could be a link to a help desk page or anything you wanted. Yeah, Gregory, go ahead.
I got a question. How you can make the format so that they could just type in their name, your email, and type in a message on your webpage and send to you?
Yeah, that's definitely something we're going to cover later on in this course when we start learning about the backend code. But the start of that is that you're going to use these exact same elements from the HTML and CSS side. So if we were in here, let's make a new page, because this is a great idea. Let's change link colors. Okay. We're going to check that in. But we don't want people emailing us, so we're going to make a contact us form. So we're going to say contact.html. Contact us. Right? And we're still going to take the files that exist, because we want to just reuse these over and over again, because these are our designs. Right? So if I right click on this and I go copy and I paste, I'm going to call this file contact.html. We can say, contact us. Oh, I put it in the wrong spot. Cancel. Contact us. All right. So instead of having this little form element that says whatever track exercise, maybe the first one will be input type equals email. Maybe we'd have a label in here that says label for equals email address. Right? When we're putting the label in here, email address. We need to make sure that the for of your label matches the ID of your element. So we'll make this email address. And instead of this being track exercise, we're going to have this be send message. Right? But we want this to be like a kind of a bigger form. So we're probably going to come in here and say we want a line break there. And then we also know, does anyone remember what the, if we wanted to have a large block of text that they could type in, what was that element from our form?
Text area.
Text area. That's great. Yep. So we're gonna say text area, and we're gonna call this name equals message. Yeah, let's make message with lowercase, and we'll say ID equals message. And we're gonna want to make this a pretty big box. So we're gonna say calls equals 20, rows equals 20. I don't know what this is gonna look like. Text area. Oop, got our slash text area. And then we probably want to have a placeholder here so that we don't have to put another label. So we're going to do placeholder, and we'll say, tell us what you think, right? So if I go to contact us now, okay, yeah, that looks ugly. So now we know, hey, I need more columns. Let's do 70 columns, and let's do 10 rows. Right? Perfect. Look. And then we can take out on this page, we don't need an activity log, and we don't need a HR, right? So this contact us page that exists on the bottom of this page, we probably actually want an extra BR here. We put 1, let's put 2. And because we're intentionally letting future developers know these are where these line breaks are coming from, not from CSS, even though that's probably a better place to put it. We have this interface here. So I can come in here and put Eric at the Clubhouse. I like your tracker. Can you connect to my Fitbit? Right. Now, we don't have this hooked up to anything. We have not gone in here and correctly created a form. Right, so we're missing this with action equals contact.html and method equals post, right? We need to have all of our inputs that we want to be able to submit together be inside of a form. And then because we just added a form, we want to indent all this stuff, right? So that's correct. Looks good stylistically. So now this is actually a form, and if I put information here, it's sending it to that page, but it's broken because we're trying to do a post. Let's make it a get. Let's reload, whatever. Right, and we can see that it actually did submit this to the page, but we haven't learned yet the back-end coding, and we're going to do that later. You need to be able to do the back-end coding, whether it's in Node or JavaScript, PHP, Python, any of the programming languages you may use throughout your career, to be able to take these values that are being sent along this input and do something with it. Like in this case, we probably want to just take whatever's in this message here, and we would probably want to go in and code something that says, take the whole content of the message, shove it into an email, and send it off to Andrew so he can fix his fitness tracker, right? We want to be able to, your customer is asking you to do Fitbit integration, right? That is, does that answer your question? This would be, we're going to design those elements that let us capture the interaction from the user. It's all going to be forms all the way down. Like the same form that we're using as the contact us stuff, like we're gonna need to use that here when we're in the weight tracker. We're gonna put in, maybe we need to have a drop down, a select option here that says like for tracking our weight and not our fitness. I might want to be 180 pounds today, and we want to have a drop down that says pounds or kilograms, right? So that we can be friendly to our overseas people that are using metric system.
I also have a question. How will you also attach a what the file called? It starts with the E. Spreadsheet on the back end.
Oh, like an Excel spreadsheet?
Yeah. So when you type in like when you do your tracker, when it'll make a spreadsheet for you. All you do is type in. It will automatically set each day when you log in to the website, and all you type in weight or type in the F side, and it will log
Yeah.
it into the
So
spreadsheet.
that too is getting quite ahead of things. That would be something we'd cover in the database portion of the class. That's going to happen, I think, around week 8. We have to be able to first not only do something with this in the back end, capture all these variables that we're uploading, we have to have a place to store it. And so, you kind of brought up a spreadsheet. I'm sure you're all familiar with Excel, or you're familiar with Google Sheets. That is just a single person's database, right? So it is a single user. It expects that the only person that's going to touch that file is you. When we're building products like this with databases, the reason we're going to use a database is because we need everybody that comes to our website to be able to interact with that system. We're going to need to be able to build a login mechanism so that I log in as Eric, and it's going to track my weight and fitness and keep it separate from Andrew's weight and fitness. Okay? We will learn to do this. It is super duper important. As I think I mentioned last week at some point, like, if you're building a website, you're building something that needs a database most of the time. Like unless you're just literally building a portfolio. Every product I've ever built in 20 years has a database in the back end, and you're always going to want to. It's always going to do something, whether through JavaScript, PHP, Python, Perl, Ruby. We used to back in the day. We used to have to write websites using C and C++. So that was painful.
Yeah. Every time I asked, I was thinking ideas for my portfolio
Yep.
when I finish, and I see
Portfolio is probably one of the few examples of a website you will ever build in your life that is perfectly fine just being a static page, doing nothing else.
I wonder how like all my information, but they also can email me for any
Yeah.
questions.
And so when we learn to do back-end programming, so I have this exact example on my website. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, I have a name, email, subject, message here. I'm not storing anything in a database. All I'm doing is literally just taking whatever the person posts and sending an email to me. And it'll say something like, new comment on a website, and I'll put the subject in as well. And we can learn that probably next week. Email is one of those tricky things, and it's hard to like speak in generalities. So much work has gone into preventing spam that what used to be the easiest thing in the world, like we could literally, in the span of a couple of hours, teach you everything there was to know about. We could write an email server together in just about the same amount of time it took, right? Like an actual entire email server that could communicate with other email servers. But nowadays, there's so much spam and so much crazy stuff you have to know that email is one of the more difficult things to get right on the internet. And most of the time, you're going to just end up using somebody like SendGrid that will provide you with an API that says, let's see if we can see an example real quick. Let's start in 5 minutes. Cool. Actually, let's go to developers and let's pick Node. Right. So we're going to learn this in our class, right? If you read their README, if you just want to send mail, if you're coming here, you're going to write a line of code that looks like this. It's going to be like, bring in this library, here's my message, and then send it, right? Because SendGrid has gone through all those crazy hoops to be really good at making sure email could get sent and delivered. And so it's almost always better to just rely on somebody else to do it. Because if you try to implement mail on your own, chances are it's not going to get delivered, or if it's going to look really wonky, or it's going to get caught in a bunch of spam filters. So this is kind of the best, the use case that you would do today.
SendGrid.
SendGrid.
Grid.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and if I do, 'cause I understand about the license. For this one, I had to, when I use somebody else's code, I had to in the down and fine print the license of the code that I use on the web page that I made.
That's going to depend. So I think what you're asking is, how do you know when you're building stuff in the future what license it is and what you have to do to follow along with those rules? Is that
If I have to cite, how will I cite
so
the
most
license?
of the time when you're using something like SendGrid, for example, this is a commercial product. They're wanting you to use their service so that they can charge you for it, right? They charge something like every 1,000 emails you send costs $1, something like that. And so all of their code and all of their examples that you get from their implementation guides in here, you're free to use in all of your projects. When we're looking at GitHub specifically, if you were going to use like that reset.css, let's say reset CSS, we were talking about a library earlier. If you use this, right, he's said in here, there is no license to use this. This is public domain. So you can copy this and use it to your heart's content. Each and everything you want to pull in that you didn't write, you just want to quickly check and say, what are the terms of me using this? Okay? And if there are no terms, if you're working in a company, if the developer that has written the library has not put a license in place, you might not have the risk to take and use that. If you're working on a private project, if somebody has put something online, they want you to be able to use it. But from the context, if you were building Facebook, for example, and you were trying to, sell yourself to a competitor, they would go as a part of that process and check to make sure that every single line of code in your product that is being purchased you're authorized to use. So it's going to really depend on a case-by-case basis, because you've got to track literally every library you use, to make sure that you're allowed to use it. Cool. So I think that really much covers, what I wanted to cover tonight, which is show you how easy it is to actually, without being with a bunch of silly examples, start to build a framework with HTML in a way that you're going to prepare yourself especially as we get later in this course and we start doing the back-end code. Like, I almost always would start every type of project like this, where I'm just going to put the key elements that I know are going to be a part of my design onto the page so I can start to visualize how it's going to look. And then as we actually start developing for interactivity, I might make my very first thing that I do is just be some simple JavaScript so that when I type 180 and I click track exercise, it will put that at the top of the list. So I can play with it a little bit and see if that type of interaction feels good, right? Because a lot of development is iterative, especially if you're working just by yourself or for yourself. You're going to play with things and just see what feels good and feels natural. If you're working in a corporate environment, you might get a kind of like our homework where it's like, do this and this and this and this, and you're not putting any experimentation in. You're just implementing what they've asked you to do. So you're going to do quite a bit of both, and a lot of times it's going to be a hybrid of both, where they're going to be like, we need to add an activity tracker. It should have a box to enter activity, and it should have a list of the activity below it. Okay, that gives me a lot of freedom of how I'm implementing this activity tracker. But sometimes you'll get it. I've gotten design documents before that had everything already drawn out, and they had everything laid out. The buttons had to be named what they wanted to be named. You're going to just find that each project is a little bit different. What else? Any other questions? Was going through this kind of exercise from start to finish pretty useful? Did it make it a little bit more concrete? Great. I'm happy to do it. Especially in these early stages when we're playing with HTML for the first time, CSS for the first time. I'm showing you everything, and the only way to really show you, most of the things is to make really ridiculous examples. And when we're looking at that previous page that had borders everywhere and crazy colors, it's easy to help you visualize, and I would encourage you to always have that in your back pocket. When even when we were building this little fitness app, you saw that I would change the background colors of these elements to something ridiculous, just so I could quickly see, okay, that's there, this is how it's going to interact as I'm increasing or decreasing the size of my page, right? It's a really good tool to help you start to do development from scratch. Does anybody else have any questions or something they'd want to go over more?
Wendy, did you get that Git bash thing figured out?
No, I didn't. I was just looking at it. I was going to mention it. Either we could do it after class or if we have time now.
I have a hard stop at 9, so now would be a great time if you want to dive in. I'll let you share your screen. I'm going to stop my recording and